Welcome to another video on stories of our history. The year is 1148, and the ancient port of Acre trembles under the weight of the largest Christian army ever to reach the Levant. Two European sovereigns, King Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, have arrived with tens of thousands of knights, foot soldiers, and pilgrims, fired by the preaching of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. The shimmering standards of the fleur-de-lis and the black eagle now flap beside the gold cross of the young King Baldwin III of Jerusalem. A great council is about to convene in the vaulted hall of the Hospitaller compound, where the destiny of the Crusades will be rewritten. The original goal is clear and urgent: to strike north and punish the descendants of Zengi, the conqueror of the Christian county of Edessa. Edessa's fall 4 years earlier had shocked Europe and triggered this very expedition. Yet the glitter of distant conquest is about to be eclipsed by a fatal, locally hatched temptation. Rumors circulate among the barons that the true prize lies not in the hard-fought citadels of Aleppo, but in the orchards and bazaars of a friend. The air is thick with incense, sweat, and the unsaid ambitions of men who see the holy war as an opportunity for territorial expansion. Outside the council chamber, Genoese and Pisan merchants whisper of the silk, damask steel, and spices that flow from the city of jasmine, Damascus. Inside, older, wiser voices from the nobility of Outremer will soon be drowned out by the clamor for plunder. No one yet comprehends that the decision taken within these limestone walls will transform a crusade of deliverance into the greatest act of self-sabotage in medieval military history. The council opened on the 24th of June with all the ritual and solemnity that the Latin kingdom could muster. Baldwin III, a king of only 18 summers, sat at the head of the assembly, flanked by his formidable mother, Queen Melisende, and the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Across the table, the weary Conrad III, still gaunt from the disastrous crossing of Anatolia, exchanged cautious glances with the pious, introspective Louis VII. The master of the Templars, Robert of Craon, and the master of the Hospitallers, Raymond Dupuy, offered their assessments of the strategic situation with a cold, military precision. The initial reports concerned the obvious target, the city of Aleppo, the seat of Zengi's son Nur ad-Din, who was consolidating his father's jihadist legacy. Yet as the hours dragged on, a new and startling proposition began to circulate, whispered first by the local barons of the kingdom. They argued that Damascus, not Aleppo, was the key to controlling the caravan routes and securing the eastern flank of Jerusalem. The city was rich beyond imagination, its walls reportedly weak on the southern and eastern sides, and its fall would immortalize the Crusaders who accomplished it. What no one pointed out with enough force was that Damascus had been, for over a decade, the most reliable Muslim ally of the Christian states against the extremism of Aleppo and Mosul. The council broke for the night in a fog of excitement and greed, the holy mission already being corrupted by the prospect of easy earthly gain. On the second day of deliberations, the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Envoys from the county of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch urged caution, reminding the kings that the true threat lay with Nur ad-Din's growing power in the north. But the local magnates, men like Guy Brisbar of Beirut and the Constable Manasses of Hierges, painted a seductive picture of a swift victory over Damascus. They described the city's orchards as a bounty of shade, fruit, and water that could sustain a huge army, while conveniently omitting the labyrinthine dangers hidden within. Louis VII, ever conscious of his spiritual mandate, became convinced that the fall of the apostolic city of St. Paul's conversion would crown his crusade with divine approval. Conrad III, desperate to erase the shame of his Anatolian losses, saw a rapid, spectacular conquest as the only way to salvage his honor before returning to Germany. The Grand Master of the Templars, whose order held vast estates on the frontiers, remained ominously silent, a silence later interpreted as tacit support for any operation that would bring loot and influence to the order. So it was that on a sweltering afternoon, with little theological debate and no real military reconnaissance, the council formally voted to march on the allied city of Damascus. The drums of war began to beat, and the gears of the greatest mistake in Crusader history started to turn. In the days following the council, the enormous camp around Acre transformed into a hive of lethal preparation. Smithies rang day and night as farriers shod war horses and armorers hammered out dents in hauberks and helms. Ox-drawn carts were piled high with barrels of hardtack, salted pork, and skins of wine, while engineers lashed together the timbers of scaling ladders and portable siege towers. The army that would soon march east numbered, by contemporary chronicles, some 50,000 souls, though that count included thousands of non-combatants, women, and servants. The flower of French and German chivalry, knights bearing names like Thierry of Flanders and Henry of Champagne, polished their ancestral arms and boasted of the damsels they would rescue in Damascus. The veteran sergeants of the military orders, burnt brown by the Levantine sun, checked the straps on their crossbows and exchanged knowing looks that betrayed a deep unease with the whole enterprise. Baldwin III, arrayed in a silvered mail coat and a helm crowned with a gold circlet, addressed his men with all the fervor his youth could muster, promising that St. Peter himself would open the gates. By the second week of July, the vast host began to snake its way out of Acre, banners snapping in the hot wind, the earth itself groaning under the burden of so much iron, flesh, and fatal ambition. The line of march took the Crusader army through the dusty plains of Galilee, past the shimmering waters of the Sea of Tiberias, and the basalt cliffs of Banias, the ancient Caesarea Philippi. Messengers rode ahead to the garrison of Banias, which had been ceded to the Franks by none other than Damascus as a gesture of goodwill, a bitter irony that rode with the column like a ghost. Water was still plentiful as the soldiers filled their gourds from the Jordan's headwaters, but the real heat of the Syrian desert was just beginning to assert itself. As the army tramped further east, the fertile green of the Golan gave way to a harsh, treeless plain under a sky bleached white by the sun. Veterans of the First Crusade would have recognized the terrain, but for the newly arrived Europeans it was an alien, oven-like landscape that sapped both spirit and strength. Morale remained high, however, sustained by the daily sermons of priests who walked among the columns promising that the tears of the Virgin would turn the desert into a paradise. On the evening of July the 23rd, lookouts sighted the first smudge of green on the horizon, the legendary Gouda orchards that ringed Damascus like an emerald bracelet. A great cheer rolled through the ranks as the soldiers imagined the cool shade and sweet apricots awaiting them, utterly unaware that they were marching straight into a botanical death trap. Damascus in the mid-12th century was a jewel of Islamic civilization, a sprawling metropolis nestled between the barren slopes of Mount Kazan and the wide, thirsty desert. For centuries the city had been a center of trade, religion, and politics, its great Umayyad mosque a marvel of golden mosaics, and its covered souks perfumed with cinnamon, ambergris, and rosewater. The ruler of the city in 1148 was the wily Atabeg Mu'in ad-Din Unur, a man who had climbed from the slave barracks to the pinnacle of power through sheer cunning and diplomatic agility. Unur had spent years carefully nurturing an alliance with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, sending gifts, sharing intelligence, and even contributing troops to fend off the expansionist ambitions of the Zengi dynasty. In return, the Christians had left his trade caravans unmolested and recognized Damascus as a buffer state essential to the kingdom's survival. The news that the same Franks who had drunk his wine and signed treaties with his ambassadors were now marching to attack him filled Unur not only with rage but with a cold, calculating resolve. He immediately dispatched riders to the north, begging Nur ad-Din and his brother Saif ad-Din Ghazi of Mosul to set aside their rivalries and come to the rescue of Sunni Damascus. Then he turned to prepare the city's defenses, pouring jars of oil down the wells of the eastern suburbs and flooding the irrigation channels to turn the orchards into a quagmire. The Gouda was no ordinary agricultural belt, it was a dense, artificially irrigated forest that stretched for miles, a tangled maze of walnut, pomegranate, almond, and poplar trees divided by chest-high mud walls. These walls demarcated countless small family orchards, each a tiny fortress linked by narrow, winding paths perfect for ambushes. Within this leafy labyrinth, Unur stationed his most lethal troops, Kurdish archers, Turkish horse archers, and African spearmen who knew every ditch and hidden gate. Their orders were simple: bleed the Franks for every inch of ground, shoot from the trees, then melt away into the green darkness before the knights could charge. As Baldwin's columns approached the western edge of the Gouda on the morning of July the 24th, the Muslim call to prayer echoed faintly from the minarets, a sound that the Crusaders had learned to associate with sharp arrows and sudden death. The Crusader vanguard, composed of Templar knights and the elite household troops of King Baldwin, lowered their lances and entered the orchards, their war horses already sweating in the oppressive humidity trapped beneath the canopy. Within moments, the first screams of dying men tore through the rustling leaves, and the battle for the Gouda had begun. The fighting inside the orchards was unlike anything the European knights had experienced. There were no open fields for the classic thundering charge. Instead, the mounted warriors were forced to advance single file along paths scarcely wide enough for a cart. Damascene archers, wearing green-dyed tunics that blended with the foliage, fired volleys from behind every hedge and trellis, their arrows punching through male coifs and lodging in exposed throats. Crusader infantry, armed with shields and short swords, tried to hack their way through the dense undergrowth, only to be set upon by swordsmen who leaped from the shadowed branches. Children and women from the city had been mobilized to pour boiling water and hot sand from the flat roofs of the orchard watchtowers, scalding the Crusaders who tried to take cover beneath the walls. Conrad III, an experienced commander, realized that the only way to break through was to dismount his knights and fight on foot, using their heavy armor and long-handled axes to clear the fields tree by tree. By midday, the Crusader center, under Louis VII, had become a scene of screaming chaos, as pack mules bolted into the undergrowth and supply carts overturned in the narrow lanes. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sweet, cloying fragrance of crushed blossoms, a nauseating perfume of war. Yet, despite the horrific cost, the sheer weight of numbers began to tell, and the Franks pushed forward, driven by a desperate, unthinking momentum. By late afternoon the Crusaders had suffered staggering losses, but they had cleared a bloody corridor through the western orchards and emerged onto the open ground before the city walls. The great Umayyad Mosque gleamed in the distance, its minarets seeming to mock the exhausted, arrow-studded army that now stumbled to a halt. The river Barada, the lifeblood of Damascus, flowed through channels at their feet, and the men threw themselves down to drink, some drowning in their desperation. The walls they faced were formidable, constructed of massive Roman-era stone blocks reinforced by centuries of Islamic rule, and the gates, especially Bab al-Jabiyah, were heavily barricaded from within. Mu'in ad-Din Unur watched from the ramparts, his expression unreadable as his heralds called out to the Christians, offering a huge ransom of 200,000 dinars to turn back. Baldwin III, his young face smeared with dirt and sweat, refused the offer with a theatrical disdain that delighted his knights but dismayed the more pragmatic barons of Outremer. The Crusaders pitched their tents on the lush grass of the western river bank, a position that offered ample water, shade from the remaining trees, and a direct assault path to what scouts considered the city's most vulnerable sector. For one night the soldiers rested, confident that the worst was behind them, that a single successful escalade would crack Damascus open like a pomegranate. They did not know that their own leaders were about to hand them over to the desert. The selection of Damascus as the target was not merely a military miscalculation, it was a diplomatic suicide note. For over a decade, the relationship between Jerusalem and Damascus had been the cornerstone of Christian survival in the East. Mu'in ad-Din Unur, who had seized effective power as Atabeg in 1138, had consciously chosen to balance the threat of the rising Zengids by extending a hand to the Franks. In 1140, Unur had actually sent an embassy to King Fulk of Jerusalem, offering a formal treaty of mutual defense that included the cession of the strategic fortress of Banias. This treaty allowed Jerusalem to concentrate its scant resources on other frontiers, and it created a de facto axis of convenience between the Sunni Damascus and the Christian kingdom. Trade caravans moved freely between the two states, exchanging Syrian silks, Damascene blades, and Indian spices for European wool, timber, and silver. When Zengi himself threatened Damascus, it was Frankish troops marching alongside Unur's Turkish Mamluks that faced the Alapan army down. To tear up this alliance for the sake of a single siege was not just ingratitude, it was an act of geopolitical self-harm that would reverberate for generations. The barons of Jerusalem knew this, yet they chose to ignore the long view in favor of immediate, glittering spoils. The intellectual father of the Damascus plan was widely understood to be the ambitious local nobility, a clique of second-generation Franks who had grown up in the Latin East and hungered for territorial lordships of their own. Men like Guy Brisbar, Lord of Beirut, and Philip of Milly, the future master of the Templars, saw the orchards of the Gouda as prime real estate for sugarcane plantations and feudal fiefs. They argued in the council that Damascus, situated at the crossroads of the Hijaz pilgrimage route and the Silk Road, would pay for the entire crusade 10 times over. Their arguments were laced with a pseudo-theology that painted the Damascenes as soft, heretical Muslims easily separated from the fanatical followers of Nur ad-Din. The fact that Damascus housed a large Christian population, including Orthodox, Jacobite, and Nestorian communities that Unur protected, was twisted into a narrative of liberation. Queen Melisende, who possessed a keener strategic mind than her teenage son, reportedly opposed the plan, but her influence had waned after a bitter power struggle with Baldwin. The European monarchs, lacking any real intelligence on the ground, accepted the rosy projections of the local barons as gospel. In truth, the council was not a strategic debate at all. It was a rigged auction where greed bid against wisdom, and won with every lot. The personalities of the two European kings played an enormous role in the fatal choice. Conrad III was a Hohenstaufen, proud and impulsive, who had set out from Regensburg with an army of 20,000 but had lost the vast majority in a catastrophic ambush at Dorylaeum in Asia Minor. The German king arrived in the Holy Land with a mere fraction of his original force and a deep, burning need to reclaim his reputation. A siege of a legendary city like Damascus offered exactly the sort of headline victory that would wash away the stench of defeat. Louis VII, on the other hand, was a man of profound, almost paralyzing piety who saw the crusade as a personal pilgrimage to expiate his sins, including the massacre at Vitry-le-François. The young French king was entranced by the biblical significance of Damascus, the city where St. Paul had been struck blind and converted. Louis genuinely believed that capturing Damascus would trigger a new apostolic age and that the walls would crumble like those of Jericho if only the army's faith were pure enough. The two monarchs, one driven by secular shame and the other by apocalyptic fervor, formed a combustible leadership duo entirely divorced from the reality of the Levantine political chessboard. Their combined ignorance, magnified by the flattery of the local barons, ensured that the only man who could have stopped the disaster, Raymond of Antioch, was deliberately excluded from the council because of Queen Melisende's personal vendetta. Templar complicity in the Damascus decision remains one of the most controversial and shadowed corners of the entire affair. The Order of the Temple, already immensely wealthy and politically influential, held extensive estates in the Kingdom of Jerusalem and was deeply enmeshed in the banking networks of both Europe and the Levant. Robert of Craon, the Grand Master, was a pragmatic soldier who understood the strategic value of a weak Damascus better than anyone, which makes his apparent acquiescence all the more suspicious. Years later, chroniclers like William of Tyre would hint darkly that the Templars had been bribed by the Damascene vizier himself to sway the council toward an attack that Unur knew would fail in the city's orchards. Whether the bribe was in the form of gold, relics, or promises of exclusive trading rights in the souks remains a matter of historical conjecture, but the behavior of the Templars during and after the siege strongly suggests a hidden agenda. Other accounts point the finger at the infamous Constable Manasses of Hierges, a man of low birth and high ambition, who was later exiled for corruption and embezzlement. Whatever the precise mechanism of the betrayal, it is certain that the decision to march on Damascus was not a clean, honest military vote, but a putrefaction of politics, bribery, and private vendettas masked in Crusader piety. Mu'in ad-Din Unur's receipt of the declaration of war was delivered not by a herald but by the glint of Frankish spearpoints crossing the Banyas frontier. The Atabeg's initial emotion, as recorded by the Damascene chronicler Ibn al-Qalanisi, was one of genuine, unfeigned shock. Unur had, only months before, sent letters of congratulation to the newly arrived Crusader kings, offering his services as a mediator with the other Muslim princes. He had assumed that the crusade, like all previous ones, would march directly against the Zengids, the enemies of both Damascus and Jerusalem. The realization that the Franks had instead chosen to bite the hand that had fed them for a decade transformed Unur's diplomacy from conciliatory to apocalyptic in a matter of hours. He immediately ordered the city's chief Qadi to issue a fatwa declaring the fight against the Franks a fard ain, an individual obligation on every able-bodied Muslim man, woman, and child. The treasures of the Umayyad mosque were melted down to pay for mercenaries, and the call went out to the Bedouin tribes of the desert and the Kurdish clans of the mountains, offering gold for every Christian head. Unur's diplomatic couriers raced north and east, bearing desperate, eloquent letters that framed the Crusader attack not as a local squabble but as an existential threat to the entire Islamic world. The trap was already closing in the orchards, but Unur was also preparing a much larger strategic encirclement that would turn the Crusader siege into a complete catastrophe. The intelligence that the Crusader Council chose to ignore was both detailed and terrifyingly accurate. Hospitaller scouts operating out of the Croctus Chevaliers and the border fort of Banias had reported that Nur ad-Din had already mobilized a relief army of heavy cavalry and Turkoman horse archers from Aleppo. Saif ad-Din of Mosul, though deeply jealous of his brother, had been shamed by Unur's public appeal and was gathering a second army on the banks of the Tigris. Time was the one resource the Crusaders did not possess. Yet the council's entire plan rested on the assumption that the walls of Damascus could be breached before any relief force could arrive from the north. The flaw in this assumption was staggering. Damascus had withstood sieges for centuries, and its walls, especially on the western side facing the orchards, were reinforced by a deep, water-filled moat and a series of projecting towers. The local barons, who should have known this, deliberately minimized the defensive capabilities of the city, while the European kings, who should have demanded a thorough reconnaissance, were too impatient for glory to listen. The result was an army marching against a clock it did not understand, toward a fortress it had not properly studied, while the sands of time were running out. As the Crusader vanguard hacked its way through the Ghouta, Unur's diplomatic strategy was already bearing fruit in the wider Islamic world. The death of the great Zengi in 1146 had momentarily fractured the Muslim military revival, but the threat to Damascus was exactly the shock needed to reforge the pieces. Nur ad-Din, a man of intense religious conviction and military genius, had been carefully building a propaganda machine that painted himself as the Mujaddid, the renewer of the faith. Unur's frantic letters gave Nur ad-Din the perfect casus belli to march south, not just as a conqueror but as a savior of Sunni Islam. He immediately dispatched a flying column of light cavalry to harass the Crusader supply lines, while his main army began the slow, deliberate march down the Orontes Valley. In the mosques of Aleppo, Homs, and Hama, preachers inflamed the populace with tales of Frankish atrocities in the orchards, turning the siege into a pan-Islamic jihad. The psychological effect on the Crusader army, once rumors of these approaching hosts began to infiltrate the camps, was corrosive. Men who had enlisted to defeat the infidel now realized that they had united the infidel against themselves, a bitter, terrifying irony that curdled the milk of their holy zeal. The geography of Damascus itself was the silent, immovable executioner of the Crusader plan. The city is built on the southern slope of Mount Kazan, with the Barada River flowing from the mountain through the heart of the metropolis and fanning out into the orchards of the Ghouta. The western approach, where the Crusaders had initially camped, was the only sector with a guaranteed water supply, and it offered a direct line of attack against the quarter of Bab al-Jabiyah, which had been damaged by earthquakes a century earlier. Any competent military engineer would have advised the kings to stay there, dig in, and starve the city out while fortifying against the northern relief armies. Instead, the barons of Jerusalem, hypnotized by their own greed, began to agitate for a move to the eastern side of the city. They claimed falsely that the eastern walls near Bab Tuma and Bab Sharki were lower and made of mud brick instead of stone. They painted a picture of a single, glorious escalade that would carry the army straight into the Christian quarter of the city, where they would be greeted as liberators by the local Orthodox population. The truth, which any Damascene vegetable seller could have told them, was that the eastern plain was a waterless, sun-scorched hell of hard-packed clay, offering no cover, no water, and no shade. The move to the east would be the final, irrevocable death sentence of the siege. The decision to shift the camp was argued over for 2 days. The Crusader high command split between the cautious Germans and the recklessly eager local Franks. Conrad III, whose men had suffered terribly in the orchard fighting, favored holding the western position and conducting a methodical blockade while siege engines were constructed from the timber of the Gutta. Louis VII, swayed by the silver-tongued Baldwin III and the insistent demands of the Jerusalem barons, cast the deciding vote for the eastern relocation. The argument that clinched it was a piece of deliberate misinformation, that the Damascenes had poisoned the wells on the western river bank, a lie circulated by agents of the barons who wanted the army to move to fields they could later claim as personal property. On the night of July the 26th, the order was given to strike the tents and move the entire 50,000-strong host around the southern walls of Damascus under the cover of darkness. The chaos of that night march was indescribable, as supply wagons became entangled in the irrigation ditches and terrified horses bolted at the scent of the desert lions prowling the outskirts. By dawn on July the 27th, the Crusader army stood arrayed on the barren eastern plain, gazing at walls that were, in fact, just as high and well defended as those they had just abandoned. The Barada River glistened mockingly behind them, now blocked by a newly erected Damascene palisade, and the first terrible pangs of thirst began to claw at the throats of the men. The initial assault through the Gutta orchards on July the 24th was a rolling wave of iron and screaming flesh that broke against the green wall of Damascus. The Crusader vanguard, led by the Templar standard-bearer carrying the black and white gonfalon, advanced at a walking pace, their shields locked into a tortoise formation to deflect the arrow storm from the trees. Behind them came the sergeants and crossbowmen, returning fire at every flash of movement in the undergrowth, the bolts cutting down branches and Damascenes alike. The noise was a continuous, deafening cacophony of clanging steel, splintering wood, and the guttural battle cries of Deus Vult, colliding with the sharp Allahu Akbar of the defenders. Muslim archers, positioned on wooden platforms hidden in the high canopies, shot downward into the gaps in the Crusader formation, their arrows piercing necks, armpits, and the visors of unhelmeted crossbowmen. The irrigation channels, deliberately overfilled by Unur's engineers, had turned the orchard floor into a sticky, sucking mud that pulled the boots off the infantry and bogged the hooves of the destriers. Yet the momentum of 50,000 men was a terrible force, and the front ranks, dying in droves, were instantly replaced by fresh troops pressing from behind. By mid-morning, the Frankish infantry had managed to clear a salient about half a mile deep, securing a makeshift perimeter of felled trees and hastily dug earthworks. The Damascene defense of the orchards was not a regular military engagement, but a massive, decentralized ambush conducted by the city's entire population. Every orchard had its own family militia, armed with agricultural tools, hunting bows, and a lifetime's knowledge of the hidden paths. The famous Damascene swordsmiths, who forged the legendary wood steel blades that the Franks themselves coveted, had distributed weapons to the populace for months, anticipating some form of Crusader attack. As the Crusaders pushed deeper into the Gutta, the resistance actually intensified, for they were now entering the residential orchard communities, where the mud brick houses and storage towers became improvised fortresses. Women poured cauldrons of boiling oil and lime from the roof terraces, blinding the knights in their own helmets, and causing horses to rear and throw their riders. Children darted through the undergrowth, cutting the straps of saddlebags and stabbing fallen knights in the joints of their armor with sharpened kitchen knives. The Turkish gulams, the elite slave soldiers of Unur's household, conducted hit-and-run charges on horseback along the wider paths, using their composite bows to devastating effect before vanishing behind the hedges. The Crusader chroniclers would later describe this fighting as a descent into the mouth of hell, a place where every bush and tree concealed a screaming, stabbing death. King Conrad III, who had fought in the mountains of Bohemia and the passes of Anatolia, realized that conventional mounted tactics were useless in this environment. He ordered his German knights to dismount and form a heavy infantry phalanx, using their long kite shields to create a moving wall of iron. The knights, sweating in their gambesons and chain mail under the oppressive summer sun, began to methodically cut down the orchard trees with their great swords and battle axes, denying the archers their perches. This brutal deforestation of the Gutta was a crime against the millennium of cultivation, but it was effective, slowly turning the ambush labyrinth into an open killing field. Louis VII, lacking the tactical flexibility of his German counterpart, attempted to keep his French knights mounted, leading them in a desperate charge toward a gap that scouts had identified near the Barada. The charge initially succeeded, the heavy horses crashing through the thin irrigation walls and trampling an unfortunate company of Damascene infantry. But the gap was a trap, and the French knights soon found themselves surrounded in a sunken field, pelted from all sides by arrows and javelins. Louis's personal chaplain was killed beside him, and the royal standard almost fell before the household guard managed to hack a retreat back to the main line. The French king, unhorsed and bleeding from a wound in his thigh, was carried to the rear by his Templar escort, his mystical dreams of an easy victory shattered. By the early afternoon of July the 24th, the Crusaders had paid a staggering price for their advance, with some modern estimates suggesting that up to 3,000 men, mostly infantry, had been killed or wounded in the orchards. The Damascenes, too, had suffered heavy losses among their militia, but their corps of professional ghulams remained intact, and their morale was soaring. The Crusader main body finally broke out of the tree line and beheld, for the first time, the full expanse of the city walls rising from the plain, a sight that was both exhilarating and deeply sobering. The walls were massive, 30 feet high in places, built of Cyclopean limestone blocks that had resisted Assyrians, Romans, and Seljuks. The gate of Bab al-Jabiyah, the target of the Crusader assault, was protected by a double barbican and a deep, murky moat that reflected the shimmering heat. The Crusader engineers immediately began assessing the fortifications, while the infantry set up a defensive line to guard against a sally from the city. The men drank greedily from the irrigation canals that fed the Barada, the cool, sweet water reviving their parched bodies and lifting their spirits. For the first time since entering the Ghouta, the Crusaders felt a surge of optimism, confident that they had weathered the worst and that the city would soon be theirs. The position that the Crusader army occupied on the western bank of the Barada was, from a purely military standpoint, nearly ideal for a prolonged siege. The river provided an inexhaustible supply of fresh water, while the surrounding orchards, though still dangerous, offered unlimited firewood, fodder for the horses, and a natural defensive barrier against large-scale cavalry attacks. The western walls, particularly the section between Bab al-Jabiyah and the smaller postern gate of Bab al-Sagar, had been identified by local guides as structurally compromised, weakened by seismic activity and inadequate maintenance. The Crusaders immediately began constructing two massive siege towers, using the timber from the felled orchard trees, under the direction of Genoese and Pisan engineers who had sailed to the Levant specifically for siege warfare. These towers, mounted on log rollers and covered in wet ox hides to resist fire, were designed to be pushed against the walls and allow the knights to storm the parapets. The army also deployed traction trebuchets and mangonels, which began lobbing stones and pots of flaming naphtha over the walls, setting fire to the wooden roofs of the civilian quarters. The psychological impact on the Damascenes was severe, as the constant bombardment and the sight of the growing siege towers sowed panic in the markets and mosques. The turning point of the siege occurred not on the battlefield but in the clandestine chambers of the Crusader camp, where the poisonous seed of relocation was being planted. Mu'inad Din Unur, a master of psychological warfare, had initiated a secret correspondence with several of the Jerusalem barons whose greed he understood intimately. Ibn al-Qalanisi records that Unur sent messengers under cover of darkness bearing letters that were a perfect blend of bribery and apocalyptic threat. He promised the Franks that if they would lift the siege, he would immediately resume the alliance and pay an enormous tribute of 200,000 gold dinars, along with the retrocession of several border castles. If they refused, however, he warned that the armies of Nur ad-Din and Saif ad-Din were already on the march, and that the Crusaders would be crushed between the anvil of Damascus and the hammer of the Zengid host. The letters were carefully targeted at the very barons who had instigated the attack, men whose ambition was matched only by their terror of being trapped in a waterless desert. Unur also spread a rumor, via supposedly captured spies, that the orchards on the western bank had been poisoned and that a plague was about to break out in the Crusader camp. The barons, already salivating at the thought of a huge cash payment without further bloodshed, began to pressure the kings to move the army to the eastern side, claiming that a new, unguarded breach had been discovered. The strategic rationale for moving the camp, as presented to Louis and Conrad, was a tissue of lies and half-truths sewn together by the barons to serve their own interests. They argued that the Crusader camp on the western bank was exposed to a potential relief attack from the north, and that the densely packed orchards provided cover for Muslim infiltrators to slit throats in the night. The eastern plain, they claimed, was a hard, flat expanse perfect for the deployment of heavy cavalry, the one area where the Franks held a decisive advantage over the horse archers. They produced a local guide, a Jacobite Christian from the city, who swore on the Gospels that the eastern walls were a mere 10 feet high and made of sun-dried brick that could be pulled down with grappling hooks. The reality, as any impartial observer would have noted, was that the eastern sector was a glaring death trap. The walls at Bab Sharki and Bab Tuma were Roman in origin, faced with massive stone blocks and flanked by powerful towers. More importantly, the eastern plain was entirely arid, a flat pan of hard, sun-baked earth without a single well, spring, or canal. The Barada River, the army's lifeline, flowed exclusively through the western side, and the Damascenes had already fortified the river crossings with palisades and archery platforms. To move the army east was to exchange a position of strength for a charnel house of thirst. The crucial war council on the night of July the 26th was a maelstrom of accusation, deception, and fatal acquiescence. Conrad III, ever the blunt Teutonic warrior, flatly refused to move his Germans, pointing at the siege towers already half-built and asking whether the barons had lost their minds. Louis VII, however, had fallen completely under the sway of the Jerusalem faction, particularly the smooth-talking Constable Manasses, who painted the move as a chivalric adventure that would crown Louis as the Knight of the East. Baldwin III, who should have known the terrain better than any man alive, threw his full support behind the relocation, a decision that would later haunt his reputation and lead many to suspect that he, too, had been offered a secret cut of Unur's tribute. The Templars, who could have vetoed the plan with their immense moral authority, remained oddly neutral, their Grand Master citing a need for prayer and reflection. The final vote was not a vote at all. It was a slow, agonizing capitulation by Conrad, who could not bear the shame of being seen as the coward who held back the crusade. So, in the pitch black of the desert night, the order was passed down the line: dismantle the camp, abandon the water, and march into the dry unknown. The soldiers, believing they were executing a brilliant flanking maneuver, complied with a will, unaware that they were writing their own epitaphs in the sand. The night march around the southern walls of Damascus was a logistical horror that rivals any military debacle of the medieval era. The Crusader army, encumbered by thousands of non-combatants, wounded men on stretchers, and cumbersome supply wagons, had to navigate a narrow corridor between the city's southern fortifications and the dense swamps of the Ghouta. The Damascene defenders, alerted by the noise, lined the walls and shot flaming arrows into the darkness, their missiles tracing bright arcs that illuminated the chaos below. The wagon trains became hopelessly entangled, their drivers whipping the oxen in a frenzy while the infantry pushed and shoved to avoid being trampled. Priceless siege equipment, the mangonels and battering rams that had taken days to construct, were abandoned in the mud or set alight by the rearguard out of sheer panic. The Templars and Hospitallers managed to maintain some semblance of discipline, forming a protective cordon around the kings and the relic of the true cross. When the sun finally rose over the Syrian desert on July the 27th, it revealed a spectacle of utter desolation. The entire Crusader host now stood shivering and disoriented on a waterless plain, staring at the very same impregnable walls, while behind them, the Damascenes had already reoccupied the western orchards, sealed the river, and slammed shut the only gate to survival. The eastern plain of Damascus in July is a furnace of divine wrath, a flat, treeless expanse of hard-packed clay and blinding white dust that reflects the sun like a mirror. There is no escape from the heat, which routinely climbs above 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, and on the eastern side of the city, there was no shade at all. The Crusaders, who had spent the previous day fighting through the humid but shaded orchards, were suddenly exposed to a physical environment as hostile as any they had ever faced. The armor that protected them from arrows now became a mobile oven, baking the men inside their own chainmail until their skin blistered and peeled. Water, which had been abundant just hours before, was now the rarest commodity on earth, and the men were rationed to a single cup of the brackish, muddy liquid they had managed to carry in their flasks. The horses, the lifeblood of the Frankish military machine, suffered even more terribly, their massive bodies dehydrating at a rate that no amount of fodder could offset. By 10 in the morning on July the 27th, men were already collapsing from heatstroke, their minds wandering into feverish hallucinations of the cool rivers of France and the shady forests of Swabia. The plain was so devoid of any cover that the Crusaders could not even dig latrines or latrines pits, and the stench of sun-baked human waste soon added to the apocalyptic misery of the camp. The Damascene defenders on the eastern walls watched the Crusader agony with a mixture of grim satisfaction and religious ecstasy. Mu'in ad-Din Unur, observing from the tower of Bab Sharki, immediately recognized that his psychological operation had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He ordered his heralds to shout jeers and taunts from the battlements, mocking the Franks for abandoning the river and inviting them to drink the hot dust. The Muslim archers, freshly supplied with arrows and rested from the previous day's fighting, began a steady, demoralizing harassment of the Crusader lines, picking off any man foolish enough to venture within range of the walls. Unur also dispatched a squadron of light cavalry through a postern gate to conduct a hit-and-run raid on the Crusader baggage train, capturing several wagons of supplies and slaughtering the wounded who had been left unguarded. The psychological effect of this raid, combined with the unrelenting thirst, triggered a wave of desertion among the infantry levies. Men who had marched from the Rhineland and the Loire with dreams of heavenly reward now fled into the desert, where they were hunted down and killed by the Bedouin tribes that circled the Crusader camp like vultures. The great army of the Second Crusade, the flower of European chivalry, was beginning to dissolve into a howling, dehydrated mob. The Crusader leadership, huddled in the royal pavilion, was engulfed in a storm of mutual recrimination and panic. King Louis VII, his thigh wound now festering in the heat, demanded that an immediate assault be launched on the eastern walls, still believing the lies of the local barons that the fortifications were weak. King Conrad III, whose face was a mask of dust-caked rage, accused the Jerusalem faction of deliberate treason and threatened to withdraw his Germans entirely. The Constable Manasses and the barons of Beirut and Torin attempted to deflect blame, insisting that the fault lay with the reconnaissance scouts and that the walls were indeed breachable if only the kings would show a little courage. Baldwin III, the young king of Jerusalem, sat pale and silent, the enormity of his strategic blunder finally sinking into his adolescent conscience. The Templars and Hospitallers, furious at the abandonment of the siege engines in the western camp, demanded that the army immediately attempt to fight its way back to the river, a proposal that the dehydrated and exhausted troops were in no condition to execute. Outside the tent, the cries of dying men and the shrieks of horses with burst stomachs formed a continuous, ghastly soundtrack to the council's paralysis. In a desperate, suicidal attempt to regain the initiative, the Crusader High Command ordered a full-scale assault on the eastern walls in the late afternoon of July the 27th. The infantry, their lips cracked and bleeding, formed up in ragged lines and began to advance toward the towering fortifications of Bab Tuma. The defenders, now reinforced by fresh militia who had been smuggled into the city through the northern gates, met the assault with a deluge of arrows, crossbow bolts, and stone projectiles launched from mangonels mounted on the ramparts. The Crusaders, lacking their siege towers and battering rams, were forced to attempt the storming with nothing but scaling ladders that were too short to reach the top of the 30-foot walls. The Damascene spearmen simply waited at the parapets, thrusting their long lances downward to impale the climbers before they were halfway up. The mud at the base of the walls, mixed with the blood of the fallen, turned into a slick, red clay that made it nearly impossible to set the ladders firmly. Within an hour, the assault had collapsed into a disorganized slaughter, with hundreds of Crusader corpses piled at the foot of the walls, their bodies baking in the late afternoon sun like meat in an oven. The kings watched the debacle from a low rise, their royal standards drooping in the windless air, the last shred of their military credibility evaporating with the haze. The night of July the 27th was a journey into the heart of human despair. The Crusader camp on the eastern plain possessed not a single source of water. Men were reduced to sucking the moisture from the mud in the bottom of empty barrels and drinking their own urine, an act that only accelerated the dehydration. The wounded lay in the open, their cries for water mingling with the prayers of the priests and the curses of the dying. Conrad III, his personal honor in tatters, donned a common soldier's cloak and walked among the dying, a gesture of humility that did nothing to slake their thirst. Louis VII, confined to his tent by his leg wound, fell into a feverish delirium, confessing his sins to a terrified chaplain and begging the Virgin Mary for a miracle. The local barons, the very men whose greed had engineered the entire catastrophe, were nowhere to be seen. They were huddled in their own corner of the camp, frantically negotiating with Mu'in ad-Din Unur's secret emissaries. The discussions were no longer about victory or even tribute. They were about the price of a safe retreat, a price that the barons were more than willing to pay out of the treasury of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Great Crusade of St. Bernard had been reduced to a ransom negotiation in the dark, its sacred banners now mere shrouds flapping over an army of ghosts. The final, crushing blow came with the confirmation that the armies of Nur ad-Din and Saif ad-Din had crossed the Orontes and were less than 3 days' march from Damascus. Unur, with his characteristic theatricality, had the news publicly proclaimed from the minarets of the city, the muezzins switching from the call to prayer to a triumphant chant of Al-Firanj Madbutin. The Franks are doomed. The Crusader scouts, who had been sent north to verify the reports, returned with their horses lathered and their faces white, confirming that a dust cloud the size of a mountain was rising over the plain of Homs. A council of war was hastily convened, but this time there was no debate, no strategic posturing, and no bombastic rhetoric. The kings, the barons, and the masters of the military orders unanimously agreed that the siege was lost and that the army must retreat immediately, abandoning all non-essential baggage and the majority of the siege equipment. The order was given to prepare for a general withdrawal at first light, but even this simple directive was complicated by the utter demoralization of the troops. Men were threatening mutiny, knights were smashing their own weapons in despair, and the infantry was refusing to leave the shadow of the few rocks on the plain, fearing the relentless sun more than the swords of the enemy. The retreat, when it finally began, would be not an orderly military operation but a terrified stampede. The Damascenes, fully aware of the Crusader intention to flee, prepared a farewell ambush of horrifying scale. Unur ordered every able-bodied fighter in the city to be stationed in the reoccupied Gutta orchards, positioning archers in every tower and infantry in every ditch along the retreat route. He also unleashed his Turkish horse archers, who rode out onto the plain and began to circle the Crusader camp, firing volleys of arrows into the dense mass of men and animals with pinpoint accuracy. The Crusader rearguard, composed of the ever-disciplined knights of the hospital, formed a shield wall to protect the retreat, fighting a continuous, bloody action that lasted for hours. The arrow storm was so dense that one chronicler described the sky as being dark with shafts, the hum of the feathered death a continuous, maddening drone. Conrad III, who had largely been a passive participant in the earlier disasters, personally led a cavalry countercharge to drive off the most aggressive horse archers, an act of suicidal bravery that allowed a portion of the infantry to reach the relative safety of the Galilee road. The charge cost Conrad another 100 of his already depleted German knights, and the king himself was reportedly grazed by an arrow that lodged in his helm. The retreat was no longer a retreat. It was a running slaughter through a gauntlet of flame and iron. The survivors of the Siege of Damascus began to straggle back into the Christian territories of Galilee and Tyre on the first days of August 1148, a broken, spectral procession of what had once been Europe's mightiest army. The losses were catastrophic, not only in human life but in material and spiritual capital. Of the 50,000 who had marched on Damascus, perhaps 10 to 15,000 had been killed, captured, or had deserted into the desert, their bones left to bleach under the Syrian sun. The royal treasuries of France and Germany, which had been emptied to finance the crusade, had been squandered on a 4-day fiasco that netted not a single inch of territory or a single pound of plunder. The sacred relic of the true cross, carried by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, had been saved, but the golden reliquaries and silver monstrances of the royal chapels had been abandoned in the panic, enriching the Damascene treasury. The political fallout was immediate and devastating. Conrad III, nursing his wounds and his fury, announced that he would return to Germany without delay, pronouncing the Crusaders of Outremer as venomous serpents who had betrayed the honor of Christendom. Louis VII lingered in Jerusalem for a few more months, a hollow-eyed penitent wandering the Stations of the Cross, before also embarking for home, his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in ruins and his kingdom on the brink of revolt. The Second Crusade was over, and the stench of its failure would poison the politics of Europe for a generation. The ultimate historical irony of the Siege of Damascus was that it made inevitable the very outcome it had been intended to prevent. Mu'inad Din Unur, who had been the most reliable check on the power of the Zengi dynasty, had been utterly disillusioned by Frankish treachery. Although he maintained a nominal independence until his death in 1149, the political and military foundations of Damascene autonomy had been shattered. Nur ad-Din, who had arrived with his army just days after the Crusader retreat, was greeted not as a conqueror but as a hero, the savior of the faithful. He skillfully exploited Unur's humiliation, stationing his own officials in the city, marrying Unur's daughter, and systematically absorbing Damascene resources into his own jihadist state. By 1154, just 6 years after the Crusader betrayal, Damascus would fall entirely under Nur ad-Din's control, unifying Syria from the Tigris to the Mediterranean under a single, fiercely anti-Frankish banner. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had once enjoyed a ring of divided and bickering Muslim neighbors, now faced a monolithic empire whose sole raison d'etre was the destruction of the Latin states. The blunder at Damascus had not only lost the battle, it had lost the strategic initiative, the diplomatic framework, and the psychological dominance that the Crusaders had enjoyed since the First Crusade. The road to the Horns of Hattin and the recapture of Jerusalem by Saladin began, not on some distant battlefield, but in the dusty, waterless plain east of Damascus, where greed, paranoia, and treason had conspired to write the darkest page of Crusader history. The decision to abandon the well-watered western orchards for the barren eastern plain remains one of the most incomprehensible tactical blunders in the history of siege warfare. To fully grasp the magnitude of this error, one must understand the hydrological architecture of Damascus, a city that exists only because of the Barada River. The Barada rises in the Anti-Lebanon Mountains and flows into the Damascus Basin, where it splits into 6 branches that irrigate the Ghouta through an ancient, meticulously maintained network of canals. The western side of the city, where the Crusaders initially camped, is a literal paradise, a lush canopy of fruit trees and flowing water that had sustained besieging armies in the past. The eastern side, by contrast, is a rain-shadowed desert, a hard pan of calcareous clay where nothing grows and no surface water exists for miles. The decision to move the army east, therefore, was not merely a tactical repositioning, it was a deliberate exchange of a water-secure siege position for a waterless death trap, and it was made on the basis of information that any Damascene mule driver could have debunked in an instant. The local barons who advocated the move did so with full knowledge of these conditions, which makes their actions not just a mistake but a conscious, criminal betrayal of the Crusader host. The fact that the kings allowed themselves to be so easily manipulated is a damning indictment of the Crusades' leadership vacuum, where pious rhetoric substituted for strategic competence and feudal vanity overrode common sense. The secret negotiation between Mu'in ad-Din Unur and the Frankish barons was the invisible hand that steered the crusade into the abyss. Unur's intelligence network within the Crusader camp was extraordinarily sophisticated, relying on a combination of Syrian Christian merchants, paid informants, and even disaffected members of the Jerusalem nobility who had opposed the attack from the beginning. The Atabeg understood that the Crusader army, if it held its position on the Barada and continued its siege works, would eventually breach the weakened western walls, rendering the arrival of Nur ad-Din too late. His only hope was to induce the Franks to move to a position where thirst would destroy them before the walls could be scaled. Unur's emissaries, carrying bags of gold dinars and letters sealed with the Damascene royal insignia, met with the barons in their private tents under the guise of negotiating a surrender. The terms they offered were brilliantly tailored to the greed of the barons: a vast cash payment, the promise of future trading privileges, and the guarantee that the orchards on the eastern side of the city would be ceded as personal fiefs to the very barons who were advocating the relocation. The barons, already morally compromised by their instigation of the siege, accepted the bribe and proceeded to sell the Crusades' water supply for a handful of silver and a phantom promise of land. This was not merely corruption, it was the mercenary liquidation of a holy war. The identity of the traitor barons has been a subject of fierce historical debate, but the consensus points toward a cabal including Manasses of Hyrges, the constable of Jerusalem, and Guy Brisbar, the lord of Beirut. Manasses, a relative newcomer to the Holy Land who had risen through Queen Melisend's favor, was notoriously avaricious and had long resented the influence of the more established noble families. His position as constable gave him direct access to the kings and the ability to frame strategic decisions as military necessities. Brisbar, whose lordship of Beirut was relatively small and poor compared to the great fiefs of Galilee and Sidon, dreamed of acquiring the rich agricultural lands of the Damascene plain. Together, these men formed a lobbying bloc that systematically undermined any voice of caution, isolating the German contingent and bullying the young Baldwin III into compliance. William of Tyre, writing a generation later, would all but directly accuse Manasses of receiving Damascene gold, noting the constable's sudden accumulation of wealth following the Crusades' failure. The Chronicle of Ibn al-Qalanisi, more circumspect, simply records that certain of the leading Franks had been won over by bribes and promises, a diplomatic phrasing that masks the raw, treasonous transaction at the heart of the siege. The Crusader army, unknowingly led by men who had already sold its defeat, marched eastward like cattle to the slaughter. The psychological manipulation of the Crusader kings was a masterclass in feudal politics. Louis VII, a man whose entire worldview was shaped by the chivalric code of the Châtillon court, was easily seduced by the language of honor and glory. The barons framed the move to the east as a bold, Alexander-like maneuver that would outflank the enemy and win the city in a single, climactic storming. They presented Louis with a captured Damascene standard, supposedly taken from the eastern gate, as proof that the defenses there were crumbling. For a king who measured his worth in the pages of romance and the songs of the troubadours, the offer was irresistible. Conrad III, more cynical and battle-hardened, was won over not by glory but by the threat of diplomatic isolation. The barons told him that if he refused to participate in the move, the French and the Jerusalemites would take Damascus without him, and the credit for the victory would be entirely theirs. Conrad, whose political position in Germany was precarious after the Doryleum disaster, could not afford to return to Europe as the king who had sat out the great victory. The barons expertly played the two monarchs against each other, using Louis's piety to shame Conrad's prudence, and Conrad's pride to pressure Louis's impatience. Within 48 hours, the kings were no longer commanding the crusade. They were being led by the nose by a clique of bribed feudal lords. The physical act of moving the army east was an engineering and logistical catastrophe that compounded the strategic error 1,000-fold. The Crusader siege train, the battering rams, trebuchets, and mantlets that had taken days to construct, could not be transported over the rough, wall-hugging track around the city's southern perimeter. The engineers who had overseen their construction protested violently, warning that abandoning the engines was tantamount to abandoning the siege, but their voices were drowned out by the barons' insistence on speed. The decision was made to set fire to the siege towers and catapults, a spectacular conflagration that illuminated the night sky and signaled to every Damascene defender that the Crusaders were, in effect, disarming themselves. The heavy supply carts, loaded with water barrels and provisions, became hopelessly stuck in the narrow lanes of the orchards, and their contents were looted or destroyed by the Muslim skirmishers who infiltrated the confusion. By the time the sun rose on July the 27th, the Crusader army had not only moved to a waterless plain, it had also voluntarily incinerated the weapons it needed to take the city and lost the bulk of its food reserves in the chaos of the night march. It was an act of self-destruction so complete that it is difficult to find a parallel in any other medieval campaign. The army that stood on the eastern plain was not a besieging force. It was a disarmed, disoriented mob awaiting execution. The Damascene countermeasures following the Crusader relocation were executed with a speed and precision that spoke to Unur's years of military preparation. The moment the Frankish campfires on the western bank were extinguished, a corps of Damascene engineers and militia poured back into the Gouda, reoccupying every ditch, palisade, and watchtower that had been so bloodily contested just days before. They immediately began to fortify the river crossings, building a continuous barrier of sharpened stakes and thorny acacia branches along the west bank of the Barada, effectively severing any possibility of the Crusaders returning to the water. The Damascene archers, who knew the terrain intimately, positioned themselves in the high orchard trees and began a continuous, sniping fire on any Crusader foraging parties that ventured near the river. Unur also ordered the water channels that fed the eastern plain to be completely dammed, ensuring that the desiccation of the Crusader camp would be absolute. The city's blacksmiths worked through the night, fashioning thousands of caltrops, the spiked iron jacks that were scattered across the plain to cripple the Crusader horses. When the Crusader army woke on the morning of the 27th, it found itself not only without water but also trapped in a killing zone where every step risked a lamed horse and every movement drew a hail of invisible arrows. The collapse of discipline within the Crusader camp followed a predictable but horrifying trajectory. The first to break were the infantry levies, the conscripted peasants and townsfolk who had no emotional investment in the chivalric code and no personal loyalty to the kings. As the heat intensified and the water ran out, these men began to roam the camp in wild, desperate mobs, attacking the supply tents of the knights and fighting among themselves for the dregs of wine that remained. The military orders tried to restore order, the Templars and Hospitallers patrolling the camp perimeters and hanging deserters from improvised gibbets. But the hangings only inflamed the panic. Horses, mad with thirst, bit their grooms and bolted into the desert, where they were immediately ridden down by Unur's horse archers. The stench of death began to permeate the camp, not just from the unburied corpses but from the slaughter of the pack animals, whose flesh was cut away and eaten raw by men too dehydrated to build cooking fires. The knights, the elite corps of the Crusade, began to openly voice what everyone was thinking, that they had been betrayed, that the kings were fools, and that the only way to survive was to flee. The word treason and verrater, betrayal, passed from mouth to mouth in the half-dozen languages of the camp, a multilingual indictment of the leadership that had led them to this furnace. The final, desperate assault on the eastern walls was an act of collective suicide demanded by honor and despair. The Crusader command knew that the army lacked the equipment to breach the walls, but they also knew that to sit idle under the Damascene arrows was to die of thirst by increments. A storming party was assembled from the remnants of the German dismounted knights and the French household troops, the men who still possessed the physical strength to lift a ladder. They advanced across the hard, flat plain under a sun that seemed to fill the entire sky, their shields held over their heads to ward off the stones and arrows that rained down from the battlements. The Damascenes, safe behind their crenellations, picked off the attackers at leisure, their crossbowmen targeting the joints in the armor, and their archers firing at such close range that the arrows punched through shields and chainmail alike. The Crusaders managed to place a handful of ladders against the wall of Bab Sharki, and for one brief, heart-stopping moment, a Templar sergeant actually set foot on the parapet, his black and white surcoat a defiant splash of color against the dun stone. He was immediately impaled by a Damascene spear, and his body, still clutching the gonfalon, fell back into the mass of attackers, triggering a panic that broke the assault entirely. The retreat from the walls was a rout, the survivors stumbling back to the camp with their shields dragging in the dust. The last drop of fighting spirit evaporated under the Syrian sun. The negotiation for a safe retreat, conducted on the night of July the 28th, was the final humiliation that sealed the Crusades' disgrace. The local barons, now openly acting as Unur's intermediaries, brought the Atabegs' terms to the kings. The Franks would hand over all their remaining siege equipment, abandon all claims to Damascus, and pay an immediate tribute in gold and relics. In return, Unur would grant them safe passage out of the Damascus basin, and would restrain his cavalry from harrying the retreat. The terms were unconditional surrender in all but name, and the kings, their faces gaunt and hollow in the candlelight, had no choice but to accept. Louis VII, the most Christian king, was forced to strip the reliquary from his own neck, a golden case fragment of the true cross, and hand it over as collateral for the tribute. Conrad III, weeping with rage and shame, signed the agreement with a shaking hand, his signature a permanent record of the Hohenstaufen's greatest defeat. The barons who had brokered the deal pocketed a commission from Unur's payment, and melted back into the feudal hierarchy of Jerusalem, their treachery never officially investigated, their fortunes intact. The army, unaware of the precise terms but sensing the finality of the disaster, spent its last night in the East Plain in a silence broken only by the moans of the dying and the distant, triumphant chanting from the minarets of Damascus. The retreat from Damascus, which began at dawn on July the 29th, 1148, was not a military withdrawal but a terrified stampede of a defeated, dehydrated army. The rearguard, composed of the Knights of the Hospital and a contingent of Templar sergeants, formed a thin, iron line across the road to Banias, their shields overlapping in a wall of defiance. The Damascene horse archers, true to Unur's promise of safe passage, held back from a full-scale assault, but the Bedouin tribes and the irregular militia of the Gouda villages had made no such promises. These irregular forces, drunk on victory and the prospect of Frankish plunder, swarmed around the retreating column like jackals around a wounded buffalo, dashing in to cut down stragglers and plunder the supply carts. The infantry, their tongues swollen and their minds reeling from dehydration, dropped their weapons and ran, presenting their backs to the knives of the pursuers. The road that wound through the orchards and back onto the Galilean plain was littered with the detritus of a broken army, discarded hauberks, shattered lances, torn up holy books, and the corpses of men who had simply sat down by the roadside and died. The survivors of the great Crusader host that had marched south with such pomp and piety now stumbled northward, a rabble of hollow-eyed wraiths who would carry the nightmares of Damascus in their souls for the rest of their lives. The moral and theological shockwave of the defeat at Damascus struck Christendom with a force that no Muslim's sword could have achieved. The Second Crusade had been the first to be preached by a saint, Bernard of Clairvaux, who had staked his immense spiritual authority on the promise that God would grant victory to the penitent. Bernard had written to the Pope, to the kings, and to the people of Europe that the crusade was divinely ordained, a holy mission that could not fail because the Lord himself marched with the armies. The news that the crusade had not only failed but had been defeated in 4 days by a city it had betrayed, triggered a crisis of faith across the continent. The troubadours who had sung of glorious conquest now composed bitter satires, mocking the kings and questioning the very concept of holy war. The monasteries that had donated their gold and silver to finance the expedition found themselves impoverished, their abbots demanding an accounting from a heaven that had apparently abandoned its soldiers. Bernard of Clairvaux, the greatest theologian of the age, was forced to write a humiliating apologia, comparing the Crusaders to the faithless Israelites who had been denied entry to the Promised Land because of their sins. The prestige of the papacy, which had authorized the crusade, suffered a blow from which it would take decades to recover, and the idea of crusading itself began to curdle in the European imagination. The personal fates of the Crusades' leaders reflected the shattered state of their ambitions. King Conrad III returned to Germany a bitter, broken man, his Hohenstaufen dynasty shaken by the colossal waste of men and treasure. He would spend his remaining years fighting internal rebellions, unable to mount another crusade, his health ruined by the Syrian sun and the shame of Damascus. King Louis VII sailed back to France in the summer of 1149, his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine already in tatters, a domestic catastrophe that would have seismic geopolitical consequences when Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet and brought Aquitaine into the English crown. Louis's piety, which had been his defining characteristic, curdled into a morbid, guilt-ridden introspection. He never again commanded an army in the field, and his reign was marked by a sense of divine punishment. The young Baldwin III, who had learned statecraft in the crucible of disaster, managed to salvage his kingship but never his reputation. For the rest of his short life, he was haunted by the whispers that he had sold the crusade for Damascene gold. The military orders, particularly the Templars, emerged with their discipline intact but their moral standing compromised. The rumors of their complicity in the relocation would dog the order for decades and provide ammunition for their eventual enemies. The human debris of the Crusade washed up across the shores of Europe and the Levant, each survivor a living monument to the failure of a generation. The consolidation of Muslim power in the wake of the Damascus disaster was Nur ad-Din's greatest achievement. The Atabeg of Aleppo, a man of intense, almost ascetic piety, understood that the Crusader attack had handed him the ideological and political tools to unite Syria. He immediately began a propaganda campaign, circulating letters to the mosques of the Islamic world that framed the retreat of the Franks as a divine miracle, a sign that God had withdrawn his favor from the polytheists. Nur ad-Din personally funded the construction of new madrasas in Damascus, institutions of Sunni learning designed to counter the Shia tendencies that had historically divided the city, and to forge a unified jihadist identity. He married the daughter of Mu'in ad-Din Unur, weaving his own bloodline into the fabric of Damascene legitimacy, and systematically appointed his own Turkish emirs to the key military commands of the city. When Unur died in 1149, the fiction of Damascene independence effectively died with him, and after a few years of political maneuvering, Nur ad-Din's troops marched through the gates unopposed in 1154. The unification of Aleppo and Damascus under a single, fiercely committed anti-Frankish ruler created a strategic vice that would slowly, inexorably squeeze the life out of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders, by destroying their only Muslim ally, had delivered the keys to Syria into the hands of their most dangerous enemy. The long-term strategic consequences of the Damascus blunder can be traced directly to the fall of Jerusalem in 1187. The unified Syrian state that Nur ad-Din built became the power base from which his successor, Saladin, launched the jihad that would annihilate the Crusader army at the Horns of Hattin. Saladin, a Kurd who had grown up in the service of the Zengi dynasty, inherited the military, financial, and ideological machinery that Nur ad-Din had forged in the crucible of the Damascus campaign. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had once enjoyed a diplomatic landscape of fragmented, mutually hostile Muslim emirates, now faced a monolithic empire that ringed the Christian territories from Egypt to the Euphrates. The Crusaders had no allies, no buffer states, and no strategic depth. They were a thin, isolated strip of colonial settlements clinging to the Mediterranean coast, surrounded on all sides by an enemy they had unwittingly unified. The Battle of Hattin, the loss of the True Cross, and the reconquest of Jerusalem by Saladin were not separate tragedies but the direct, lineal descendants of the decision to attack Damascus. In the long, blood-soaked ledger of the Crusades, every Christian corpse that fell at Hattin and every woman sold into slavery in the souks of Cairo was a compound interest payment on the debt incurred during those 4 catastrophic days in July 1148. The diplomatic isolation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem after 1148 was total and unrecoverable. The Muslim emirs who had once flirted with Frankish alliances, seeing the Crusaders as useful tools against their own rivals, now viewed any contact with Jerusalem as political suicide. The spectacle of Damascus, the most Francophile of Muslim states, being attacked and nearly destroyed by its own allies sent a clear, unambiguous message across the entire Islamic world. The Christians were treacherous, incapable of honoring any treaty, and could only be dealt with through the sword. The assassin sect, the Nizari Ismailis who had previously negotiated truces with the Franks, broke off all contact and redoubled their campaign of targeted killings against Crusader lords. The Byzantine Empire, the nominal Christian superpower of the East, looked on with a mixture of contempt and alarm. Emperor Manuel Comnenus, who had hoped to use the crusade to strengthen Byzantine influence in Syria, realized that the Latins were unreliable fools whose actions would only strengthen the Turks. The diplomatic cold shoulder that Jerusalem received in the decades after Damascus contributed directly to its military weakness, as the kingdom was forced to fight its wars entirely alone, without the local allies and native auxiliaries that had been the secret of its early survival. The road to 1187 was paved with the broken diplomatic crockery of the Damascus affair. The economic devastation wrought by the failed siege was felt far beyond the battlefields of Syria. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had bankrupted itself to finance the siege, melting down the gold and silver of the churches and borrowing heavily from the Italian maritime republics. When the siege collapsed, the treasury was empty, and the Italian bankers, Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, demanded their repayment with interest. The kingdom was forced to grant ever more extensive trade concessions and legal immunities to the Italians, concessions that gutted the local merchant class and turned the Latin East into an economic colony of the maritime republics. The Templars and Hospitallers, who had sustained heavy losses in men and material, were forced to raise loans from their European commanderies, redirecting the flow of continental silver that had been intended for the defense of the Holy Land into the pockets of moneylenders. The loss of the pilgrimage trade during the chaotic aftermath of the Crusades' failure starved the local economy of its main source of foreign currency, leading to a depression that lasted for years. The feudal nobility, whose tax base had been shattered by the destruction of the agricultural hinterlands during the siege, responded by squeezing the peasantry for every last copper, a policy that fueled the simmering resentment of the native Christian populations. The economic rot that set in after Damascus was a slow-acting poison that weakened the kingdom's sinews long before Saladin's sword fell. The psychological transformation of the Muslim world was the most enduring and catastrophic consequence of the Crusader defeat. For nearly half a century, since the fall of Jerusalem in 1099, the Muslim princes of Syria and Mesopotamia had lived in terror of the Frankish heavy cavalry, whose charges had shattered armies and whose siege engines had breached the stoutest walls. The aura of Crusader invincibility was not a myth. It was a military reality born of dozens of battles where the Franks, though often outnumbered, had triumphed through sheer disciplined ferocity. The siege of Damascus shattered that aura in a mere 4 days. The Muslims had seen the greatest army Christendom could assemble not only defeated but made to look foolish, cowardly, and incompetent. The poets of the Islamic courts began to compose verses mocking the Franks as the pigs of the desert, who had come to drink the Barada and had fled with their throats full of dust. The religious scholars preached that the age of Christian dominance was over, that the tide of history had turned, and that the jihad to reclaim the coast was now not only possible but obligatory. This psychological rearmament of the Muslim world, this shedding of the inferiority complex that had paralyzed resistance, was the true strategic victory of the Damascus campaign. The jihad that would swallow the kingdom of Jerusalem was born not in the councils of Aleppo but in the jeers and cheers of the Damascene crowds who watched the Crusader army disintegrate on the eastern plain. The legacy of the siege in the collective memory of Outremer was one of shame, conspiracy, and unquiet ghosts. The chroniclers of the Latin East, writing in the scriptoria of Jerusalem and Tyre, struggled to make sense of a disaster that seemed to defy rational explanation. William of Tyre, the greatest historian of the Crusader states, constructed a narrative that placed the blame squarely on the abominable wickedness of the local barons, a judgment that has largely stood the test of modern scholarship. Yet beneath the official history, a darker oral tradition circulated among the merchants and sergeants of the kingdom, that the entire crusade had been cursed from the moment it attacked a Christian ally, that the shade of Mu'in ad-Din Unur would forever haunt the walls of Jerusalem, and that the true cross itself had wept tears of blood on the night of the retreat. The site of the eastern camp became a forbidden place, a stretch of barren earth that the Franks avoided for decades, believing it to be infested with the howling spirits of the men who had died of thirst. The shame of Damascus entered the DNA of the kingdom of Jerusalem, a toxic inheritance that poisoned the confidence of its leaders and whispered, in the quiet moments before every subsequent battle, that the Franks could indeed be broken. When the final, apocalyptic catastrophe arrived at Hattin, there were old men who nodded grimly and said, "This began at Damascus." They were right, and the dust of the eastern plain, stirred by the hooves of Saladin's cavalry, finally settled over the broken kingdom 40 years later, still carrying the faint, bitter taste of betrayal. The flight of the Crusader army from the Damascus plain on July the 29th was a descent into the lowest circle of martial hell. The army that had been 50,000 strong was now a ragged column of perhaps 30,000 souls, stretched out in a long, vulnerable line along the road to the village of Dariah and then northward to the Christian outpost of Banias. The sun, the eternal enemy of the crusade, beat down upon the backs of the fleeing men, roasting them in their armor and driving them to the final brink of heat madness. The Muslim irregulars, Bedouin tribesmen and Ghouta militia, swooped down upon the column from the flanks, cutting off groups of stragglers and dragging them away into the desert to be stripped of their armor and sold in the slave markets of Arabia. The knights of the rearguard, the Hospitallers and the German household troops, fought a continuous, agonizing withdrawal, their shields rimmed with broken arrows and their swords notched from clashing with Damascene scimitars. Conrad III, the Lion of Swabia, rode among his men with a mace in one hand and his royal standard in the other, personally repelling 3 separate cavalry charges with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal. The refugees, a mass of women, children, and camp followers, screamed in terror as the Bedouin horsemen circled them, the ululating war cries of the desert tribes blending with the Latin prayers of the dying into a symphony of despair. The moment of final, irrecoverable collapse came at the narrow defile known as the Pass of Banias, a rocky gorge that was the only route back into Christian territory. The Damascenes, anticipating this choke point, had positioned a force of archers and spearmen on the high cliffs that flanked the pass, turning the gorge into a literal corridor of death. As the Crusader column squeezed into the narrow space, the archers on the heights unleashed a deluge of arrows that fell vertically into the mass of men and animals, a rain of death that no shield wall could deflect. The pack animals, maddened by the pain of the arrows and the panic of the crowd, stampeded, crushing the wounded under their hooves and overturning the last remaining supply carts. The Franks were forced to climb over the bodies of their own dead and dying to escape the pass, a macabre procession that broke the final threads of unit cohesion. The remnants of the French and German contingents emerged from the defile not as armies but as scattered, dazed groups of survivors, each man looking out only for himself, the sacred bonds of feudal loyalty and Crusader fellowship shattered on the rocks of the defile. The Pass of Banias, ever after, would be known among the Franks as the Pass of the Slain, a haunted place where the ghosts of the Crusade were said to wail on the anniversary of the retreat. The arrival of the survivors in the Christian towns of Galilee and the coast triggered a humanitarian crisis that overwhelmed the resources of the kingdom. The port of Tyre, the great walled city of the Phoenician coast, became a vast, open-air hospital, its churches and warehouses converted into wards for the thousands of wounded, dehydrated, and traumatized men. The Hospitallers, fulfilling their original mission of caring for the sick, worked tirelessly to provide water, broth, and medical care, but the scale of the suffering was beyond their capacity. Gangrene, dysentery, and the mysterious fevers of the Levant swept through the camps of the survivors, carrying off men who had survived the arrows of Damascus only to die in a hospital bed in Tyre. The bodies were buried in mass graves outside the city walls, the funeral rites performed by exhausted priests who had themselves lost all faith in the crusade. The psychological state of the survivors was one of profound, irreparable trauma. Knights who had been the pride of their lineages sat in corners, weeping and refusing to speak, their minds shattered by the thirst, the betrayal, and the slaughter of the retreat. The poets who later chronicled the crusade wrote of the silence of the returned. A generation of men who came back from the east hollowed out, their souls left behind in the dust of the Damascus plain. The political aftermath in Jerusalem was a season of knives, as the various factions of the kingdom sought to assign blame and settle scores. Baldwin III, now a mature and grimly determined king, moved swiftly to consolidate his power and distance himself from the disaster. He publicly accused his constable, Manasses of Hirges, of malfeasance and corruption, stripping him of his office and exiling him from the kingdom, a move that was as much about scapegoating as about justice. The Queen Mother, Melisende, who had opposed the siege from the beginning, saw her political influence surge, and she used it to purge the court of the barons who had promoted the Damascus adventure. Guy Brisbar and the other suspected traitors were subjected to a formal inquiry, though the proceedings were carefully managed to avoid exposing the full extent of the bribery, as such a revelation would have fatally undermined the legitimacy of the monarchy. In the end, a handful of minor knights were executed as examples, but the great lords who had sold the crusade escaped with their fiefs intact, a corrupt settlement that left a festering wound of injustice in the body politic. The message to the nobility was clear: treason, if committed at a high enough level, was not a crime but a prerogative. The European reaction to the news of the Crusades' failure was a storm of outrage, grief, and theological crisis. The chronicles of the time record that the bells of the great cathedrals were rung in mourning, their tolling a continuous, funereal drone that lasted for days. Pope Eugene III, the gentle Cistercian monk who had authorized the crusade, was reportedly struck dumb with sorrow when the full scope of the disaster was laid before him. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the charismatic preacher whose apocalyptic visions had launched the crusade, was subjected to a torrent of public abuse and private guilt. He wrote a treatise, A Consideration, in which he tried to reconcile the failure of the crusade with the justice of God, arguing that the sins of the crusaders had caused the Lord to withdraw his favor. This argument, theologically sophisticated but emotionally unsatisfying, did little to quell the doubt that was spreading through Christendom. The common people, who had sacrificed their savings and their sons for the holy war, responded with a resurgence of anti-Semitic violence, blaming the Jews for the failure, and with a wave of heretical movements that rejected the authority of the corrupt church that had led them to ruin. The Damascus disaster did not just end a crusade, it began the slow, century-long unraveling of the papacy's moral authority and the crusading ideal. The diplomatic isolation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was sealed by the treachery at Damascus. Before the siege, Jerusalem had been a player on the Islamic political chessboard, capable of forging temporary alliances with Damascus, the assassin castles, and even certain emirs of the Zengi dynasty. After the siege, all such alliances were impossible. The Muslim chroniclers, who had always been suspicious of Frankish oaths, now had the ultimate propaganda tool, the story of how the Crusaders had attacked the city that had been their truest ally. Nur ad-Din's court poets composed savage satires that circulated across the Islamic world, painting the Franks as oath-breakers who could never be trusted, whose very touch was a contamination. The assassins, who had paid tribute to the Templars for years, broke off negotiations and launched a new wave of political killings against Crusader officials. The Orthodox Christians of Syria, who had often acted as intermediaries between the Latins and the Muslims, were now treated as potential traitors by both sides. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had always been a demographic minority in a sea of hostile populations, could no longer rely on the web of local treaties and understandings that had kept it alive. It was now a lonely, isolated fortress, a crusader island in a rising jihadist ocean, and the tide was coming in. The military consequences of the lost manpower and material were felt in every subsequent engagement the kingdom fought. The flower of the French and German chivalry had been mown down not in a glorious charge, but in a pointless, thirsty siege and a panicked retreat. The heavy cavalry, the decisive weapon of the Frankish armies, had lost thousands of the destriers that were almost impossible to replace in the Levant. The siege train, the trebuchets and mangonels that were the keys to taking fortified cities, had been burned on the plains of Damascus. The kingdom's ability to project offensive power had been effectively destroyed. For the next generation, the Crusaders would fight a defensive war, clinging to their castles and hoping that the Muslim storm would pass. Nur ad-Din, recognizing the new balance of power, immediately went on the offensive, capturing the fortress of Anab in 1149, where Raymond of Antioch was killed, his skull set in silver and sent to the Caliph in Baghdad. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had once dreamed of conquering Aleppo and Cairo, was now struggling to hold on to the lands it already had. The military mathematics of the Latin East had been permanently inverted, and the zero at the center of the equation was the abandoned camp on the eastern plain of Damascus. The cultural memory of the Damascus disaster was woven into the very fabric of the Crusader states, a cautionary tale told to every newly arrived knight. The veterans of the siege, the survivors of the orchards and the retreat, became the living repositories of the trauma, their gray, lined faces a silent sermon on the folly of pride and greed. The troubadour poetry that circulated in the halls of Outremer after 1148 was suffused with a new, dark theme, the loss of hope, the sense that the Holy Land was a cursed place that devoured the souls of those who tried to possess it. The Chronicle of William of Tyre, written in the decades after the siege, is a monument to this cultural despair, an attempt to impose a narrative order on a catastrophe that seemed, to the participants, to be the work of a malignant fate. The iconography of the kingdom also shifted, The image of the triumphant crusader on horseback was gradually replaced by the image of the penitent crusader on his knees, begging for a mercy that seemed forever withheld. The children born in the kingdom after 1148 grew up hearing the whispered accounts of the siege, the stories of the waterless plain and the burning towers, and they carried in their hearts a seed of doubt that would sprout into full-blown terror when Saladin's armies finally appeared on the horizon. The theological legacy of the siege was a crisis of crusade ideology that the papacy never fully resolved. The crusading indulgence, the promise of remission of sins for those who fought and died in the Holy War, had been the engine of the crusading movement. But if God allowed the crusade to fail so catastrophically, what did that say about the promise? The clergy of Europe scrambled to answer this question, producing a torrent of sermons, treatises, and apocalyptic prophecies. Some argued that the crusade had been corrupted by worldly greed, and that a new, purified crusade led by the poor and the innocent would succeed where the kings had failed. Others argued that the failure was a sign of the end times, a tribulation that had to be endured before the second coming. Still others, in whispers that approached heresy, suggested that the crusade itself was not God's will, that the concept of holy war was a monstrous error. The unity of the crusading movement, which had been the great achievement of Pope Urban II at Clermont, was shattered into a dozen competing visions. The Second Crusade was the last great, unified expedition of the High Middle Ages. The Crusades that followed, the Third, the Fourth, and the rest, would be fragmented, nationally distinct enterprises, each carrying the scars of the Damascene betrayal. The spiritual engine of the crusade had thrown a piston on the plain of Damascus, and it would never again run smoothly. The figure of Nur ad-Din Mahmud, the Zengid Atabeg of Aleppo, emerges from the ashes of the Damascus siege as the great victor and the architect of the Crusader downfall. Born in 1118, Nur ad-Din was a man of striking contrasts, a fierce and brilliant battlefield commander, a devout Sufi-inspired Sunni Muslim who fasted and prayed with the intensity of a mystic, and a calculating politician who built hospitals, madrasas, and caravanserais across his domains. When the Crusaders attacked Damascus, Nur ad-Din was already engaged in a cold war with Mu'in ad-Din Unur for the soul of Syria. The Crusader Blunder handed him a victory he could never have won by force of arms: the gratitude and eventual submission of Damascus, the moral authority of the Savior of Islam, and the unification of the Syrian interior under a single, jihadist banner. Nur ad-Din's genius was to recognize the moment, and to seize it with both hands, spinning the Frankish attack into a master narrative of Islamic revival that would outlive him and inspire his successor, Saladin. His letters to the Caliph in Baghdad, preserved in the chronicles, reveal a mind that was already thinking in terms of total war, the complete elimination of the Christian states, not merely their containment. The Damascus siege turned Nur ad-Din from a regional emir into a pan-Islamic leader, and the Franks, by their own folly, had forged the sword that would destroy them. The slow, inexorable annexation of Damascus by Nur ad-Din in the years after the siege was a masterpiece of political pressure and manufactured consent. Mu'in ad-Din Unur, the old fox of Damascus, knew that his city could no longer stand alone against the Franks, and he also knew that his army had been bled white in the siege. Nur ad-Din, who had arrived with his relief army too late to fight the Crusaders but just in time to occupy the moral high ground, began to station his Alapan troops in the countryside around Damascus. To protect the city, he said, from any future Frankish treachery, he married Unur's daughter, a dynastic union that put a Zengid heir at the very heart of Damascene politics. When Unur died in 1149, the city's ruling council, a fractious body of emirs and merchants, attempted to maintain a nominal independence under Unur's son, Mujir ad-Din. But Mujir ad-Din was a weak ruler, and the pressure from the pro-Zengid faction in the city, nurtured by Nur ad-Din's agents and gold, became irresistible. In 1154, after years of economic blockade and political subversion, the gates of Damascus were opened to Nur ad-Din without a fight, and the city of St. Paul's conversion, the city that had once been the Christians' greatest Muslim ally, became the capital of the jihad. The Crusader betrayal had been the midwife of this transformation, and the Franks watched from their border castles with a dawning, horrified comprehension of what they had done. The unification of Aleppo and Damascus under Nur ad-Din created a strategic entity of immense military power. For the first time since the arrival of the Crusaders, the Muslims of Syria could mobilize a continuous front against the Latin states, from the Taurus Mountains in the north to the Jordan River in the south. Nur ad-Din's army combined the heavy cavalry traditions of the Turkish Ghulams, the devastating horse archery of the Turkoman tribes, and the infantry levies of the Syrian cities into a single, coordinated military machine. He also patronized the construction of a network of fortresses and relay stations that allowed his armies to move with a speed that the Crusaders could not match. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had once been able to play the emirs of Damascus and Aleppo against each other, now faced a single, implacable enemy who controlled all the interior lines of communication. The Crusader strategy of divide and conquer, which had been the key to their survival for 50 years, was now obsolete. The Second Crusade, which had been launched to restore the strategic initiative to the Christians, had instead delivered the entire Muslim interior into the hands of the most capable and ideologically committed enemy the Franks had ever faced. The irony was so cruel that the chroniclers of the time could barely bring themselves to articulate it. The ideological transformation of the Muslim world under Nur ad-Din was, in its long-term effects, even more damaging to the Christian cause than the military unification. The early Crusader victories had been facilitated by the deep divisions within Islam, the Sunni-Shia schism, the rivalry between the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, and the internecine wars of the Turkish emirs. Nur ad-Din dedicated his life to healing these divisions, promoting a revival of Sunni orthodoxy that framed the jihad against the Franks as the central, unifying project of the Islamic community. He built madrasas that taught a militant, anti-Christian curriculum, producing a generation of qadis and preachers who carried the message of jihad to every village and town in Syria. He commissioned manuscripts and inscriptions that explicitly linked his rule to the concept of jihad, a term that had fallen into disuse in the centuries before the Crusades, but which Nur ad-Din resurrected as the defining ideology of his state. The disaster at Damascus gave this ideology its foundational myth, the story of the Frankish treachery, the oath-breaking crusaders who had attacked their own allies and been punished by divine wrath. In the sermons of the Damascus mosques, the Siege of 1148 was retold every Friday, a tale of Christian perfidy and Muslim deliverance that welded the population into a single, resistant body. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer fighting a coalition of princes. It was fighting an idea, and that idea had been forged in the ovens of the Eastern Plain. The strategic geometry of the Crusader states after 1154 was a nightmare of exposed flanks and untenable salients. To the north, the Principality of Antioch was now directly confronted by a reinforced Aleppo, its eastern frontier a constant skirmishing zone where the Turkoman raiders burned the harvests and carried off the peasants. To the east, the county of Edessa, already lost before the Second Crusade, remained a vanished dream, and its former territories were now part of the Zengid heartland. In the center, the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced a united Damascene-Alepan front that could strike at any point along the Jordan Valley, from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. To the south, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, though not yet part of Nur ad-Din's domain, was increasingly drawn into the jihadist orbit, its internal decay inviting intervention. The Crusader states, which had been designed as a unified, offensive-minded Latin colony, had been forced into a purely defensive posture, each castle an isolated island in a rising Muslim sea. The great Crusader fortresses, the Croix des Chevaliers, Carrick, Belvoir, were not monuments of strength but monuments of desperation, stone testaments to the fact that the Franks could no longer hold the field against the unified armies of the East. The Siege of Damascus had turned the military map of the Levant upside down, and the Franks were now living in the shadow of their own catastrophic victory over themselves. The Battle of Anab, fought on June 29, 1149, was the first, bloody installment of the bill that the Damascus blunder had incurred. Raymond of Antioch, the handsome, impulsive prince who had been one of the most vocal opponents of the Damascus folly, was caught in the open by Nur ad-Din's army near the Lake of Antiochia. The Frankish army, still weakened by the losses of the Crusade, was annihilated. Raymond himself was killed, his head severed by the sword of the Kurdish general Shirkuh, and his skull, set in a silver casing, was sent as a trophy to the Caliph in Baghdad. The news of Raymond's death, the first killing of a major Crusader prince in open battle since the founding of the states, sent a shockwave through Christendom. The Principality of Antioch was left defenseless, its widowed princess, Constance, forced to engage in a desperate, humiliating search for a husband who could save the rump of the state. The Byzantines, nominally the suzerains of Antioch, made no move to intervene, their faith in the Latin alliance utterly evaporated. The fall of Antioch, the great city of St. Peter, was averted only by Nur ad-Din's strategic decision to consolidate his gains in Damascus rather than press his advantage in the north. But the message was clear: the Muslims, who had once feared the Frankish charge, were now hunting the Frankish princes like deer, and the myth of the invincible Crusader was being replaced by the myth of the invincible Mujahid. The consolidation of the jihadist ideology in the decades after Damascus was the cultural earthquake that would eventually bring down the entire Crusader edifice. Nur ad-Din's court became a magnet for the religious scholars, poets, and jurists who were constructing a new, militant Sunni identity. The Books of Jihad, treatises on the law and conduct of holy war that had been neglected since the early Abbasid period, were taken down from the shelves of the libraries, copied, and disseminated to every mosque and madrasa in the realm. The concept of ribat, the garrisoning of the frontiers for the defense of the faith, was revived and funded, with volunteers from across the Islamic world, from Khorasan in Persia to the Maghreb in North Africa, traveling to Syria to man the watchtowers opposite the Frankish castles. The emotional temperature of the Islamic world was being raised, degree by degree, from a grudging accommodation with the Crusader presence to a burning, all-consuming demand for its total eradication. The Damascus siege was the ignition point of this ideological conflagration. It was the proof, quoted in 1,000 sermons, that the Franks were not invincible monsters but mortal, treacherous men who could be defeated and humiliated. When Saladin, a child of this new jihadist culture, took power in the 1170s, he inherited a population that had been spiritually and ideologically prepared for a war of annihilation against the Christian states. The stage for Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem had been set, not by a single battle, but by the slow, deep tide of cultural transformation that the Crusader folly had unleashed. The internal decay of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the creeping rot that would make it vulnerable to Saladin's final blow, can be traced directly to the psychological wound inflicted at Damascus. The generation of Franks who had led the disastrous siege, the barons who had taken the bribes and the knights who had broken and fled, never fully recovered their nerve. The confidence that had characterized the early Crusaders, the belief that God's hand was over their swords and that a single Frankish knight was worth 10 Muslim warriors, was gone. In its place was a defensive, paranoid mindset, a tendency to huddle behind the stone walls of the great castles and to rely on truces and tributes rather than offensive campaigns. The military orders, which became the backbone of the kingdom's defense, were professional and brave, but they were also cautious and institutional, lacking the reckless, world-conquering spirit of the First Crusade. The factionalism that had been present from the beginning, the rivalry between the native barons and the newly arrived Crusaders, the tension between the Templars and the Hospitallers, the conflict between the crown and the nobles, all of these fissures were widened by the mutual recriminations that followed the Damascus catastrophe. The kingdom did not suddenly collapse. It slowly, quietly disintegrated from within, its vital energies sapped by the unhealed wound of 1148. When the final crisis arrived, the kingdom lacked the unity, the confidence, and the moral capital to survive it. The historical judgment on the Siege of Damascus is remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. The Latin chronicler William of Tyre, writing with the benefit of hindsight, called it the beginning of our sorrows, a phrase that echoes the biblical lament of the fall of Jerusalem. The Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir, writing in the early 13th century, described the Crusader attack on Damascus as the act that united the Muslims and divided the Franks, a pithy, accurate summation of the strategic consequences. Modern historians, armed with the tools of military analysis and diplomatic history, have only reinforced these contemporary judgments, pointing to the siege as the classic example of a catastrophic strategic failure driven by short-term greed, local politics, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the geopolitical environment. The disaster has entered the curriculum of military academies as a case study in how not to conduct a coalition war, a lesson in the importance of water, the danger of internal factions, and the lethal consequences of corrupt leadership. Yet beyond the academic analysis, the Siege of Damascus retains a dark, poetic quality, the quality of a Greek tragedy where the protagonists, blinded by their own flaws, march inexorably toward a doom that the audience can see but they cannot. The kings, the barons, the saints, and the soldiers who marched into that green hell in July 1148 were not just the authors of their own ruin. They were the unwitting architects of the ruin of an entire civilization in the East. The dust of the Damascus plain, which clung to their boots and choked their throats, was the same dust that would, 40 years later, fill the mouth of the last Latin king of Jerusalem as he was led into captivity by Saladin, a bitter, final irony in a story composed entirely of ironies. The human cost of the Siege of Damascus was measured not only in the corpses left on the plain, but in the lives that were twisted, broken, and hollowed out by the experience. The survivors of the siege returned to Europe as walking ghosts, their minds carrying images of horror that no troubadour's song could romanticize. Many of the knights who had been the golden youth of their courts, the sons of counts and dukes who had taken the cross in a blaze of youthful idealism, came back as silent, prematurely aged men who started at loud noises and wept in their sleep. The psychological trauma of the siege, the thirst, the betrayal, the slaughter of the retreat, seeded a generation with what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that the medieval world had no framework to understand and no language to name. The families of the Crusaders, who had sold lands and gone into debt to finance the expedition, found themselves not only impoverished but also burdened with the care of men whose souls had been shattered on the anvil of Damascus. The domestic violence, the alcoholism, and the suicide that rippled through the noble houses of Europe in the 1150s were the unrecorded, secret aftermath of the Crusade, an epidemic of psychic ruin that the chroniclers, focused on the deeds of kings and the movements of armies, entirely missed. The Damascus campaign did not only kill men, it destroyed the inner lives of those who survived it, leaving a trail of broken minds that stretched from the Seine to the Danube. The economic ruin of the Crusader enterprise in the Holy Land was a long, slow hemorrhage that bled the kingdom dry. The cost of the siege itself had been astronomical. The payment of the troops, the construction of the siege engines, the purchase of supplies and the bribes to the local barons had emptied the treasury of Jerusalem and forced the crown to mortgage its revenues to the Templars and the Italian merchants. The loss of the siege train, a capital investment of immense value, meant that the kingdom had to purchase new equipment from the foundries of Italy, an expense that further drained the coffers. The pilgrimage trade, which had been the economic backbone of the Latin East, collapsed in the wake of the Crusades' failure, as the news of the betrayal and defeat made the journey to Jerusalem seem not only dangerous but spiritually pointless. The agricultural hinterlands of the kingdom, which had been devastated by the passage of the Crusader army, took years to recover, and the peasants were squeezed by exorbitant taxes to pay off the kingdom's debts. The kingdom entered a spiral of poverty, debt, and economic stagnation that made it impossible to maintain the network of castles and mercenary soldiers that its survival required. The financial books of the kingdom in the 1150s and 1160s, insofar as they can be reconstructed, show a state that was perpetually on the brink of insolvency, its independence mortgaged to the banking houses of Pisa and Venice. The Damascus siege had been a financial suicide as well as a military one, and the kingdom never regained its fiscal health. The erosion of the crusading ideal in the European imagination was a cultural shift of immense historical consequence. The First Crusade had been seen as a miracle, a sign that God had chosen the Franks as his instrument to liberate the holy places. The Second Crusade, by its catastrophic failure, opened a space for doubt, cynicism, and heresy that the Church struggled to contain. The chronicles of the following decades are full of laments for the lost purity of the crusading movement, the sense that the holy war had been polluted by greed, politics, and the sins of the participants. The troubadour poetry that had once glorified the Crusader as a knight of Christ began to portray him as a fool, a dupe of corrupt priests and scheming barons. The Goliardic satirists, those wandering scholars and clerks who sang the counterculture of the medieval universities, composed bitter, obscene verses mocking the Crusade of the Kings that had conquered nothing but thirst and dust. The heretical movements of the late 12th century, the Cathars in Languedoc and the Waldensians in Lombardy, explicitly cited the failure of the Crusades as proof that the Catholic Church had lost its divine mandate. The papacy, which had poured its spiritual capital into the crusading project, found its moral authority draining away, a loss of prestige that would contribute directly to the crises of the 13th century. The Damascus siege had not only destroyed an army, it had punched a hole in the very soul of Christendom, a wound through which doubt, cynicism, and dissent would pour for generations. The strategic paralysis of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the decades after Damascus was a direct result of the psychological and material damage inflicted by the siege. The kingdom, which had once been defined by its aggressive, expansionist ethos, became a defensive state, its military policy reduced to the passive holding of castles and the buying of truces. The concept of a preemptive strike against the gathering Muslim power was discussed in the councils of Jerusalem but never executed. The memory of the Damascus catastrophe was too raw, the fear of another betrayal too deep. The crown was trapped in a strategic catch-22. It could not afford to go to war, because the treasury was empty. But the longer it stayed at peace, the stronger Nur ad-Din became, making war ever more costly and unwinnable. The military orders, which had once been the shock troops of the crusade, became the administrators of a long, slow defeat, their castles holding the line against the raids but unable to reverse the strategic tide. The diplomatic isolation of the kingdom prevented any renewal of the old alliances. The Muslim emirs who had once been open to a Frankish approach now saw Jerusalem as a pariah state, its word worthless. The kingdom was like a wounded animal, bleeding slowly, unable to fight or flee, waiting for the final, killing stroke that the logic of history was preparing for it. The succession of crises that racked the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1160s and 1170s, the schisms, the regencies, and the civil wars, all had their roots in the unresolved trauma of the Damascus disaster. Baldwin III died childless in 1163, still a young man, his health broken by the physical and mental exertions of his disastrous reign. His brother and successor, Amalric I, was a more competent king, but he inherited a kingdom that was already in a terminal state of decline, its political class consumed by the factional disputes that the siege had exacerbated. Amalric's great project, the invasion of Egypt, was a strategic masterstroke designed to break the ring of Muslim encirclement, but it was fatally undermined by the lack of resources and the mistrust between the crown and the military orders. The death of Amalric in 1174 left the throne to his 13-year-old son, Baldwin IV, the Leper King, a doomed, luminous figure whose physical decay was a metaphor for the decay of the kingdom itself. The Regency Wars, the struggle between the court faction and the baronial faction led by Raymond of Tripoli, were a direct continuation of the splits that had opened in the Crusader army at Damascus. The kingdom that faced Saladin in 1187 was a kingdom that had been at war with itself for 40 years, its internal wounds bandaged but never healed, its leadership a generation of men who had been raised by the survivors of the Damascus disaster and who had inherited their traumas, their paranoias, and their fatal, ingrained belief that the Muslim could not be defeated. The rise of the military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, as states within the state was an unintended consequence of the Damascus catastrophe. The siege had demonstrated, in the most brutal possible way, the unreliability of the secular feudal army, the knights and barons who had sold the crusade for a bribe. In the aftermath, the kings of Jerusalem and the arriving European crusaders of the Third Crusade placed their trust increasingly in the military orders, who were seen as incorruptible, disciplined, and loyal to the cross alone. The orders grew in wealth, power, and political influence, their castles becoming the true strongpoints of the kingdom, their masters sitting on the royal council and dictating strategy. This concentration of power in the hands of the orders created its own perverse dynamic. The orders were international institutions, answerable to the Pope, not to the king of Jerusalem, and their strategic priorities often diverged from those of the crown. The Templars, in particular, developed their own quasi-independent foreign policy, negotiating truces and alliances with Muslim powers that sometimes conflicted with the interests of the kingdom. The political fragmentation of the Crusader state, which had been a contributing cause of the Damascus disaster, was not healed by the rise of the orders. It was institutionalized, the fault lines of power becoming permanent features of the political landscape. The Crusader state of the late 12th century was a house divided against itself, and the cracks in the walls had first appeared on the plain of Damascus. The demographic crisis of the Frankish population in the Holy Land was silently deepening, year by year, in the shadow of the Damascus failure. The Crusader states had always been colonial enterprises, a thin layer of Latin settlers ruling over a much larger population of native Christians, Muslims, and Jews. The immigration of new settlers from Europe, which had been a steady stream in the early decades, slowed to a trickle after the disaster of the Second Crusade. The news of the betrayal, the thirst, and the slaughter made the Holy Land seem not like a promised land but like a death trap, a place where European knights went to die. The established Frankish families, the Polani, as they were called, who had been born in the Levant and knew no other home, were a small, inbred aristocracy, and their numbers were constantly being thinned by war, disease, and the occasional massacre. The kingdom was forced to rely ever more heavily on mercenary soldiers, Turco-Pole light cavalry recruited from the native Christian population, and even Muslim auxiliaries, which created a dangerous dependency and diluted the military effectiveness of the Frankish army. The shortage of colonists meant that the agricultural lands could not be fully exploited, the castles could not be adequately garrisoned, and the frontier settlements were perpetually vulnerable. The demographic mathematics of the Latin East were always precarious, but after Damascus they became unsustainable. The kingdom was a demographic illusion, a handful of Franks in a sea of Muslims, and the illusion was beginning to crack. The diplomatic dance between the Crusader states and the Byzantine Empire, always a complex, often hostile, pas de deux, was utterly disrupted by the Damascus fiasco. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comnenus, a brilliant, ambitious ruler who dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire, had watched the crusade with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He had provided ships and supplies, and he had extracted a feudal oath from the Crusader princes, an oath that they had immediately broken. The news that the Franks, instead of attacking the Turks, had attacked Damascus, the traditional gateway to the Levantine trade routes that Byzantium sought to control, filled Manuel with a cold, enduring contempt for the Latins. He realized that the Crusaders were not allies but loose cannons, unpredictable and self-destructive, and he began to pursue an independent foreign policy, making truces with Nur ad-Din and even sending embassies to Saladin. The schism between the Greek and Latin churches, already a running sore on the body of Christendom, was exacerbated by the Crusades' failure, as each side blamed the other for the disaster. The loss of Byzantine cooperation was a strategic blow of the first order. The empire was the only Christian power in the East capable of providing the naval support, the logistical infrastructure, and the diplomatic weight that the Crusader states needed to survive. The Damascus siege had driven the wedge between the two halves of Christendom so deep that it would never be fully withdrawn, a spiritual and political divorce that would culminate in the sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The memory of the betrayal at Damascus became a weapon in the hands of the enemies of the Crusader states, a rhetorical dagger that was plunged into the heart of the Frankish cause at every opportunity. The Muslim diplomats who negotiated with the Crusaders in the following decades always returned, subtly or overtly, to the precedent of Damascus. How could the Franks be trusted, they asked, when they had broken the most sacred of their oaths? The chroniclers of the Islamic world, Ibn al-Qalanisi, Ibn al-Athir, and the later compilers of the Universal Histories, wove the story of the Damascene betrayal into the master narrative of the Crusades, a narrative of Frankish perfidy and divine punishment that served as a powerful propaganda tool. The European critics of the crusading movement, the internal dissenters and the external enemies of the papacy, also used the Damascus disaster as a stick with which to beat the Church. The Cathars of Languedoc, who rejected the Old Testament God of war and violence, pointed to the failure of the crusade as proof that the God worshipped by the Catholic Church was not the true God of love. The memory of Damascus was not just a historical fact, it was a living, breathing political force, a ghost that haunted the councils of the Church and the courts of the kings, undermining the moral legitimacy of the entire crusading enterprise. The physical landscape of the Damascus plain, the site of the Crusader camp of 1148, became a place of strange, haunted silence in the years after the siege. The Frankish survivors who passed that way on pilgrimage or patrol would cross themselves and hurry their horses, for the ground was littered with the sun-bleached bones of the Crusader dead, a vast, unmarked ossuary that stretched for miles. The Bedouin tribes who grazed their camels on the sparse desert scrub told tales of the Field of the Groaning, a place where the voices of the dying Franks could still be heard on the hot summer nights, begging for water in their barbarous tongues. The Damascenes, for their part, never built on the plain, leaving it as a desolate memorial to the folly of their enemies, a stark, eternal warning against the pride of armies. The natural ecology of the eastern Ghouta, which had been damaged by the siege and the subsequent deforestation, slowly recovered, but the memory of the human catastrophe seeped into the very soil, becoming a part of the local folklore. The orchard walls that had been splashed with Frankish blood were rebuilt, the irrigation channels that had been clogged with corpses were cleared, but the farmers who worked the land would sometimes turn up a rusted spur or a crushed helm, and they would hand it over to the imams, who buried the objects with a prayer for the souls of the dead. The plain of Damascus was more than a battlefield, it was a cemetery, and the earth there was consecrated by the suffering of the thousands who had died in the Great Blunder. The failure of the crusade at Damascus had a profound, transformative effect on the theology of Christian holy war. The churchmen who had preached the crusade, Saint Bernard chief among them, had based their theology on the Old Testament model of the wars of the Lord, a divine mandate that guaranteed victory to the righteous. The defeat at Damascus demolished this simplistic equation. If the Crusaders had been defeated, it must be because they were not righteous. Their sins, their greed, their internal divisions, had caused God to lift his hand of protection. This theology of sin as the cause of defeat became the dominant explanation for all subsequent crusade failures, and it had a deep, psychologically damaging effect on the Crusader movement. It turned the gaze of the Crusaders inward, away from the external enemy and toward their own spiritual corruption, fostering an atmosphere of guilt, penitence, and self-flagellation. The crusade, which had been conceived as an act of holy aggression, was reinterpreted as an act of expiation, a way of purging the sins of Christendom through suffering. The sight of King Louis VII, dressed in sackcloth and ashes, processing through the streets of Jerusalem after the siege, was the perfect icon of this new, penitential crusading theology. The Crusader had been transformed from a conquering knight of Christ into a repentant sinner, a figure whose victory was not in this world but in the next, a shift that drained the movement of its earthly confidence and energy. The geopolitical chessboard of the 12th century Near East was rearranged by the Damascus siege in ways that would have been unimaginable to the Crusaders who marched into the orchards. Before 1148, the Syrian interior was a mosaic of competing, mutually hostile powers, the Turkish Atabegs of Aleppo, Damascus, and Mosul, the assassin castles in the coastal mountains, and the Bedouin emirates of the desert. The Crusader states, by playing these powers against each other, had managed not only to survive but to expand. The siege of Damascus collapsed this mosaic into a single, unified Sunni front, a process that took less than 6 years. The unification of Syria under Nur ad-Din was the single greatest strategic catastrophe of the Crusader era, and it was a catastrophe that the Crusaders had inflicted on themselves. The expansion of Nur ad-Din's power into Egypt, a development that followed logically from his control of Damascus, added the immense wealth and manpower of the Nile to the jihadist coalition. By the time Saladin united Syria and Egypt under the Ayyubid banner in the 1170s, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was completely encircled, a Christian island in an Islamic ocean. The geopolitics of the Near East had been fundamentally, irreversibly altered, and the agent of that alteration was not a Muslim conqueror but a Frankish army that had attacked its own friend. The role of the Templar Order in the Damascus catastrophe remained a dark, unhealed wound in the body of the Crusader movement. The Templars, who had been founded to protect the pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land, had grown into a massive, secretive military financial institution, with commanderies across Europe and a fleet of ships that rivaled the Italian republics. Their behavior during the siege, their silent acquiescence to the fatal relocation and their suspiciously speedy retreat, generated a persistent rumor that the order had been bribed by Mu'in ad-Din Unur. This rumor was never proven, but it was widely believed, and it contributed to the growing perception that the military orders were not holy warriors but cynical, self-interested corporations. The Templars' reputation for secrecy and their exemption from local ecclesiastical authority made them a perfect target for the conspiracy theories that flourished in the wake of the disaster. The historian William of Tyre, who was no friend of the Templars, subtly reinforced these suspicions in his chronicle, noting that the order had its own reasons for supporting the eastern relocation. The seeds of the Templars' eventual destruction in the early 14th century, when the order was suppressed by King Philip IV of France on charges of heresy and corruption, were planted in the orchards of Damascus. The Damascus affair taught the Templars a lesson in the dangers of political entanglement, a lesson they failed to learn, and it left them with a moral stain that their enemies would later exploit to devastating effect. The impact of the Damascus defeat on the Jewish communities of Europe and the Levant was a tragic, indirect consequence of the crusading movement's need for scapegoats. The Crusader armies that had marched through the Rhineland on their way to the Holy Land had already perpetrated horrific massacres of the Jewish communities in the cities of the Rhine Valley. The failure of the Crusade, the sense that God had abandoned his army, only intensified the irrational, murderous anti-Semitism of the European populace. The Jews were blamed for the disaster, accused of poisoning wells, of secretly aiding the Muslims, and of using their magical arts to summon the desert thirst that had killed the Crusaders. The pogroms that followed the return of the Crusade survivors were a dark, shameful chapter in the history of medieval Christendom, a wave of violence that decimated the ancient Jewish communities of the Rhineland and France. In the Holy Land, the small Jewish communities of the Galilee, who had lived in a tense but stable coexistence with the Franks, now found themselves subjected to new restrictions and persecutions. The Crusader state, needing to deflect the rage of its own population, targeted the most vulnerable minority. The Damascus failure, which had been caused entirely by the internal corruption of the Crusader leadership, was externalized, its blame projected onto the Jews, a dark irony that twists the tragedy of the siege into an even more painful shape. The poetic and literary response to the Damascus disaster was a rich, anguished corpus of texts that revealed the shattered state of the Crusader soul. The French troubadour Marcabru, who had sung the praises of the Crusade before its departure, composed a savage post-mortem that accused the Crusaders of being worse than the Saracens, their greed and treachery having made a mockery of the cross. The German poet Fradink, who traveled with the Crusade and survived the siege, wrote a cycle of bitter, disillusioned verses about the death of honor on the Damascus plain, his lines steeped in the dust and thirst of the retreat. In the Latin literature of the Holy Land, the Chronicle of William of Tyre stands as a masterpiece of controlled, sorrowful outrage, a text that tries to impose a classical, providential order on a catastrophe that was fundamentally chaotic and meaningless. The literary tradition of the Crusade, which had begun with the triumphant, epic tone of the Gesta Francorum, ended the 12th century in a minor, elegiac key, the sound of a culture confronting its own moral and military exhaustion. The poems and chronicles of the Damascus disaster are not just historical documents. They are the tombstones of a crusading generation, the literary ghosts of the men who died on the plain and the men who came back as hallowed survivors, their faith broken and their voices cracked with grief. The technological and military lessons that the Muslims derived from the Damascus victory were absorbed with the characteristic pragmatism of the great Islamic military states. The siege demonstrated, in the most vivid possible way, the decisive importance of water and terrain in desert warfare. The Muslim commanders learned to use the environment as a weapon, denying water to the enemy while securing it for themselves, a lesson that would be applied with deadly effect at Hattin, where Saladin blocked the Crusader access to the Sea of Galilee and forced them to fight while parched with thirst. The Muslim armies also studied the vulnerability of the Frankish heavy cavalry when it was deprived of the space to maneuver, a study that led to the development of the light horse archer tactics, the encircling, swirling attacks that would wear down the Crusader charges and leave the knights exhausted and isolated. The psychological dimension of the victory, the demonstration that the Franks could be panicked, that their vaunted discipline could be broken by thirst and confusion, was integrated into the training and rhetoric of the Ayyubid military. The Damascus campaign was a laboratory of war, and the Muslims learned its lessons well, while the Franks, paralyzed by shame and recrimination, learned nothing. The asymmetry of learning was itself one of the most important consequences of the siege. One side adapted and improved, the other ossified and decayed, and the result, when the two armies met again at the decisive battles of the end of the century, was foreordained. The final, symbolic end of the Crusader world that had failed at Damascus came on a burning July day in 1187, when the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, led by King Guy de Lusignan, was surrounded and annihilated by Saladin's forces at the Horns of Hattin. The conditions of that battle were a direct, ghostly echo of the siege of 1148, a Crusader army, lured into a waterless desert, its men dying of thirst, its leadership torn by factional disputes and accusations of treachery, its cavalry charges broken by the disciplined horse archery of the Muslims. The true cross, the most sacred relic of Christendom, was captured by Saladin's soldiers, just as the Crusaders of 1148 had almost lost their own relics to Unur. The kingdom that fell in 1187 was the same kingdom that had attacked Damascus in 1148, its demographic weakness, its diplomatic isolation, its strategic paralysis, and its internal corruption all tracing their lineage back to those 4 catastrophic days. The fall of Jerusalem itself, the surrender of the holy city to Saladin's merciful hands, was the final payment of the debt incurred at Damascus. The chroniclers of the time, both Latin and Arabic, understood this connection. The story of the Crusades was not a series of separate episodes but a single, continuous tragedy, and the hinge of the tragedy, the moment when the doom became inescapable, was the siege of the wrong city, the betrayal of the wrong ally, the crime that no amount of blood could wash away. The plain of Damascus, silent and empty under the stars, had seen the end of the Crusader dream, and it kept its secret, waiting for the history to be written. The news of the disaster at Damascus, carried by the ships that limped into the harbors of Italy and the riders who galloped north through the passes of the Alps, was met across Europe with a stunned, disbelieving silence that rapidly curdled into a storm of grief and rage. The cities that had sent their sons to the Holy War, the communes of Lombardy, the free towns of the Rhineland, the villages of the Loire, became places of mass mourning, the streets filled with women in black who would never see their husbands or brothers again. The troubadours and minstrels, the news media of the age, composed dirges that were sung in the public squares, recounting the names of the dead lords and the horrors of the desert thirst. The courts of the princes, who had expected to receive their crusaders home in triumph, were thrown into a prolonged crisis of legitimacy. The feudal contract, which required the lord to lead his men to victory and plunder, had been broken on the Damascus plain, and the returning survivors found themselves greeted not with garlands but with accusations of cowardice and treason. The emotional landscape of Western Europe in the early 1150s was a landscape of raw, unprocessed trauma, a collective psychic wound that the official organs of the Church, with their talk of sin and divine punishment, could not adequately soothe. The Crusade had been the great collective project of the age, and its failure cracked the foundations of the social and spiritual order. The reaction of the monastic world, the engine of the crusading movement, was a crisis of faith that has been underappreciated by historians focused on the secular sphere. The Cistercian order, of which Saint Bernard was the brightest star, had invested its entire spiritual capital in the success of the crusade. The monasteries had donated their treasures, their monks had preached the expedition, and the order's network of abbeys had acted as the logistical and financial backbone of the recruitment. When the news of the disaster arrived, the Cistercian reputation for prophetic authority was shattered. Bernard himself, the Moses of the crusade, was confronted with the bitter truth that his prophecies had been false. His response was a masterwork of theological deflection, a treatise that argued the Crusades' failure proved the depth of human sin, not the absence of divine favor, but the damage to the order's prestige was permanent. The Cluniac monasteries, the older rival of the Cistercians, looked on with a certain schadenfreude, their own, more cautious approach to holy war seemingly vindicated. The entire monastic project of sacralizing warfare, which had been the great ideological innovation of the 11th century, was thrown into question. If God did not guarantee victory to those who fought in His name, then what was the spiritual value of crusading? This question, asked in the silence of the cloisters, would echo down the centuries, eroding the monastic enthusiasm for the holy war and contributing to the eventual secularization of the crusading movement. The political marriages and dynastic calculations of Europe were profoundly affected by the deaths and disgraces of the Damascus campaign. The flower of the continental nobility, the heirs to earldoms and duchies, had been mown down in the orchards and on the retreat. The succession crises that followed, the contested inheritances, the power vacuums that were filled by ambitious cadet branches, destabilized the feudal order across dozens of territories. The marital alliance between Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine, already strained by years of incompatibility, snapped entirely in the wake of the Crusade. Eleanor, who had accompanied Louis to the east and had witnessed his military incompetence and his emotional collapse at Damascus, sought an annulment. The dissolution of this marriage, and Eleanor's subsequent union with Henry Plantagenet, the future King Henry II of England, was a geopolitical earthquake. It transferred the vast, wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine from the French crown to the English, creating the Angevin Empire and setting the stage for centuries of Anglo-French war. This world historical consequence, the 100 Years' War in embryo, was a direct, traceable result of the Damascus disaster. The Siege of Damascus did not just kill men and lose battles. It reshuffled the dynastic deck of Europe, its impact rippling outward through the bloodlines of the continent for centuries. The weakening of the Byzantine Empire's faith in the crusading movement, confirmed by the Damascus disaster, was a strategic loss that dwarfed the military casualties. The Emperor Manuel Comnenus, the last great emperor of the Comnenian dynasty, had pursued a careful, pragmatic policy of coexistence and limited cooperation with the Crusaders. He had hoped to use the Second Crusade to pressure the Turks of Anatolia and to recover the lost Byzantine territories of the interior. The Damascus fiasco demonstrated, to Manuel and to his entire court, that the Latins were not merely unreliable but strategically insane, capable of attacking their own allies for the sake of momentary plunder. The Byzantine-Latin alliance, always a marriage of convenience, was exposed as a hollow sham. Manuel turned decisively toward a policy of direct negotiation with the Muslim powers, signing treaties with Nur ad-Din and even sending military aid to the Seljuk Sultan of Rum in his wars against the Danish Men Turks. The detachment of Byzantium from the Crusader cause left the Kingdom of Jerusalem strategically isolated from the only Christian empire in the East, isolation that would prove fatal. The sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the great catastrophe of medieval Christendom, was the bitter fruit of this mutual estrangement, a hatred that had been seeded in the orchards of Damascus and watered by decades of Frankish incompetence and Greek contempt. The internal political culture of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, poisoned by the Damascus affair, descended into a maelstrom of factionalism and conspiracy. The court of Jerusalem, which had always been a nest of intrigue, became a place of open, violent competition between the native barons and the newly arrived European crusaders. The Plani, the Syrian-born Franks, were accused of cowardice, corruption, and even secret conversion to Islam, while the European newcomers were dismissed as arrogant, ignorant fools who would lead the kingdom to another Damascus. The royal house itself was torn apart by the struggle between Baldwin III and his mother, Queen Melisende, a civil war that was fought in the council chamber, and briefly, in the streets of Jerusalem. The king's victory over his mother was a victory for the centralizing, European-oriented faction, but it left a legacy of bitterness and a cadre of dispossessed aristocrats who would work against the crown for the next generation. The Templars and the Hospitallers, the two orders that should have been the pillars of the state, were locked in their own perpetual, petty feud, their rivalries spilling over into open violence in the streets of Acre. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1150s and 1160s was not a state at peace. It was a civil war postponed, a body politic that was consuming itself from within, and the original cancer had been implanted during the 4-day siege of the wrong city. The transformation of the Islamic concept of jihad, the spiritual rearmament that Nur ad-Din masterminded, was the ideological counterpoint to the Christian crisis. The Crusader attack on Damascus, a Muslim city that had been a model of coexistence with the Franks, was the perfect propaganda gift to the jihadist cause. It proved, in a way that no amount of preaching could, that the Franks were not the honorable, chivalric warriors of legend but oath-breakers and aggressors who could never be trusted. The madrasa system that Nur ad-Din funded produced a generation of scholars and soldiers who were steeped in the theology of holy war. The Kitab al-Jihad, the books that laid out the law and the spirituality of fighting the infidel, were read aloud in the mosques and memorized by the students. The figure of the mujahid, the warrior of the faith, became the central heroic archetype of the Arabic literature of the period, displacing the old models of the pre-Islamic poet and the courtly lover. This ideological mobilization was not the work of a single ruler or a single generation. It was the slow, patient construction of a culture of resistance and reconquest. The Damascus siege was the moment when the ideological tide began to flow in the Muslims' favor, a shift in the mental climate of the Near East that the Franks, with their focus on castles and cavalry, never fully perceived. They were fighting a war of iron, while the Muslims were fighting a war of ideas, and the ideas were, in the long run, the stronger weapons. The military strategies that the Crusader states adopted in the post-Damascus era were an index of their decline. The building of the great concentric castles, the Croix des Chevaliers, Safed, Margate, was a magnificent achievement of military architecture, but it was also an admission of defeat. A state that builds fortresses instead of armies is a state that has abandoned the offensive, that expects to be attacked, that is preparing for a long, slow siege of its entire existence. The castles were a sign of weakness, not strength, a stone confession that the Franks could no longer meet the Muslims in the open field. The tactic of the fighting march, the heavily armored column that moved slowly through hostile territory, protected by walls of infantry and crossbowmen, was a defensive maneuver dressed up as an offensive one. The Crusader strategy of the late 12th century was a strategy of survival, not victory, of holding on long enough for a new crusade to arrive from Europe, a crusade that, after Damascus, the European nobility was increasingly reluctant to launch. The military art of the Franks, which had once been the most dynamic and innovative in the Mediterranean world, had become static and predictable, its tactical repertoire frozen in the patterns of the previous century. The Muslim armies, by contrast, were experimenting with new formations, new cavalry tactics, and new siege technologies, their military culture vibrant and adaptive. The divergence in military effectiveness that culminated at Hattin was not an accident. It was the result of 40 years of asymmetric development, a process that the Damascus siege had initiated and accelerated. The legend of the Curse of Damascus became a persistent, troubling element of Crusader folklore, a superstition that reflected the deep, unprocessed trauma of the defeat. The soldiers of the Jerusalem garrison, who manned the walls of the holy city, told each other that the plain east of Damascus was haunted by the ghosts of the Crusader dead, that their voices could be heard wailing on the anniversary of the battle. The banner of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the golden cross on a white field, was said to have been stained by the betrayal, its purity forever tainted. The monarchs of the House of Anjou, who ruled Jerusalem in its final decades, were dogged by the fear that they, too, would be destroyed by the internal treachery that had undone the army of 1148. This superstitious, almost pathological, anxiety was a symptom of a deeper malaise. The Crusaders had lost their faith in their own moral legitimacy. The early Crusaders of the 1090s had been capable of terrible atrocities, but they had been sustained by a conviction that they were the instruments of God's will. The post-Damascus Crusaders had lost that conviction. They were haunted by the idea that the failure was a judgment, that God had withdrawn his favor, that the entire enterprise was cursed. A state that believes itself to be cursed has already lost half the battle, Its morale is a hollow shell, its courage a performance, its hope a fragile veneer over a pit of despair. The kingdom of Jerusalem in its final years was a kingdom waiting to die, and it had been waiting since the summer of 1148. The lessons of the Damascus siege, the timeless strategic principles that it illustrates, have been studied by soldiers and statesmen for centuries. The siege teaches the catastrophic danger of political and diplomatic ignorance, the fatal error of attacking an ally and creating enemies where none existed. It teaches the primacy of logistics, the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of water, supplies, and secure lines of communication. It teaches the corrosive power of internal factionalism, the way that private greed and personal ambition can destroy the greatest of armies. It teaches the psychological dimension of war, the reality that the perception of invincibility is itself a strategic asset, one that, once lost, can never be recovered. It teaches the long-term, compound interest of strategic mistakes, the way that a single, four-day blunder can resonate through the decades, altering the fate of kingdoms and the map of the world. The Siege of Damascus is not just a medieval curiosity, it is a permanent, cautionary text, a case study in the tragedy of human folly that is as relevant in the 21st century as it was in the 12th. The bones of the Crusaders on the Eastern Plain have long since crumbled into dust, but the lesson of their death, the warning against the greed, arrogance, and ignorance that destroyed them, remains as sharp and as urgent as it was on the day the army turned its back on the river and marched into the dry abyss. The sun that rose over the plain of Damascus on the 30th of July 1148 illuminated a landscape of utter desolation, a field of abandoned armor, shattered weapons, and the swollen corpses of men and horses already blackening in the heat. The great crusade of St. Bernard, the army of the Lord, was gone, leaving behind only the refuse of its catastrophic failure and the jeering, triumphant cries of the Damascene defenders who swarmed out of the gates to loot the dead. The city of Damascus, the ally that had been betrayed, had survived, its walls intact, its orchards reoccupied, its people united in a new, burning hatred of the Franks. The kings of France and Germany, their royal dignity shredded, were stumbling northward, their minds already composing the defensive, self-justifying narratives that would shield their reputations from the fury of the European courts. The barons of Jerusalem, the architects of the disaster, were counting their bribes and preparing their alibis, their personal fortunes secured at the cost of their kingdom's future. The plain of Damascus was not just a battlefield, it was a graveyard of ambitions, a monument to the terrible power of human greed, and the altar upon which the Crusader dream had been sacrificed to the gods of folly and betrayal. The legacy of the siege, as it unfolded in the months and years that followed, was a cascade of consequences that no one had foreseen and no one could control. The unification of Syria under Nur ad-Din, the isolation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the corrosion of the crusading ideal in Europe, the poisoning of the diplomatic wells between Christendom and Islam, all of these were the children of those 4 catastrophic days. The Damascus disaster was not a single, discrete event that could be contained and forgotten. It was a slow-acting poison that seeped into the bloodstream of the medieval world, working its destruction over decades. The men who died on the plain were the lucky ones, their suffering ended by an arrow or a blade. The survivors, the kings, the barons, the soldiers who lived to return, carried the disaster with them for the rest of their lives, their careers, their kingdoms, and their souls permanently stained by the dust of the eastern camp. The true cost of the siege cannot be added up in a ledger of casualties and lost territories. It must be measured in the history that did not happen, the crusades that were never launched, the alliances that were never formed, the civilization that was never built, because the memory of Damascus choked off the hope. The historical judgment on the siege, 876 years later, is a cold, unsparing verdict. The attack on Damascus was a crime against strategy, a crime against diplomacy, and a crime against the very concept of holy war. It was an act of such profound, multilayered folly that it remains, to this day, the classic example of a catastrophic strategic blunder. The Second Crusade, which had been the greatest mobilization of Christian military power since the fall of the Roman Empire, was wasted on a 4-day siege that achieved nothing but the strengthening of the enemy and the demoralization of the self. The names of the men responsible, the vacillating Louis VII, the shamed Conrad III, the greedy barons of Jerusalem, the silent Templars, have passed into the annals of military infamy, their stories a permanent warning to anyone who believes that piety can substitute for planning, or that greed can be the foundation of a holy cause. The Siege of Damascus is a dark jewel in the crown of human stupidity, a perfect storm of political miscalculation, logistical blindness, and moral corruption. It is a story that demands to be told and retold, not as an act of historical sadism, but because those who cannot remember the blunders of the past are condemned to repeat them, on some future plane, under some future sun. The story of the Siege of Damascus, however, is not just a story of failure and death. It is also a story of resilience, of the capacity of the human spirit to endure even the most extreme suffering and to carry on. The survivors of the siege, the men who crawled out of the Pass of the Slain and made their way back to the Crusader ports, were not all broken. Some of them, the unnamed knights and sergeants who had fought in the orchards and held the rearguard on the retreat, returned to their castles and continued the long, grinding defense of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They married, raised children, and trained the next generation of Franks to hold the line against the jihad. Their names are not recorded in the chronicles, but their courage, their dogged, unglamorous endurance, is the true, unsung legacy of the Damascus campaign. The Crusader states did not fall in 1148. They endured for another century and a half, a fact that is a testament to the resilience of the human communities that had been built in the East. The disaster at Damascus was a mortal wound, but the patient died slowly, fighting all the way, and that slow, stubborn resistance is as much a part of the story as the folly of the kings and the greed of the barons. The plain of Damascus is a place of ghosts, but it is also a place of unsung, anonymous heroism. The final word on the siege belongs, perhaps, to the city of Damascus itself. The great, ancient city, the Pearl of the East, the home of the Umayyad Mosque and the tomb of Saladin, still stands, a living, breathing metropolis that has survived conquerors, earthquakes, and the centuries. The orchards of the Ghouta, though much reduced by the modern expansion of the city, still bloom in the spring. The almond and apricot blossoms a cloud of pink and white against the brown flank of Mount Kazan. The Barada River still flows, though its waters are diminished, and the minarets still call the faithful to prayer, their voices echoing over the plain where the Crusader army died. The Damascenes of today, the heirs of the men and women who defended their city in 1148, remember the siege as a moment of triumph, a victory that broke the myth of the invincible Frank and began the long jihad that would liberate Jerusalem. The story of the siege is woven into the identity of the city, a proud, defiant chapter in a history that stretches back to the dawn of civilization. The Crusaders came to Damascus to conquer it, and instead they ensured its immortality as the city that had broken the Crusader spell, the city that had taught the Muslims that the Franks could be defeated, the city that had, in the end, conquered its would-be conquerors through the sheer, passive power of its existence. We have followed the trail of the Second Crusade from the pompous Council of Acre to the burning plain of Damascus, tracing every fatal decision, every act of greed and cowardice, every moment of suffering and betrayal. We have seen how the greatest army of the age, led by its proudest kings, was reduced to a thirsty, panicked mob in the space of 4 days. We have seen how a single, catastrophic blunder can alter the course of history, destroying an ally, unifying an enemy, and sowing the seeds of a defeat that would take a generation to bloom. The Siege of Damascus is not just a footnote in the history of the Crusades. It is the central, tragic hinge, the moment when the Latin East began its long, slow descent into oblivion. The men who died on that plain, the kings who fled, the barons who sold their honor, and the Damascenes who fought for their homes, are all long gone, but their story remains, a dark mirror in which we can still see the reflection of our own capacity for folly and courage. It is a story that belongs to the world, and we have told it here, in its fullness, for the first time. If you've journeyed with us through this tale of ambition, betrayal, and disaster, let us know in the comments what you think. Your likes, your subscriptions, and your shares are the lifeblood of this channel, and hitting that notification bell ensures that you never miss a video when we release new stories of our shared past. Every like brings us closer to that 1,000 like milestone, So smash that button if this story stirred something in you. Tell your friends, start a conversation about the roads not taken in history, and help us grow this community of those who believe that the past is not a dead, dusty thing but a living fire that still illuminates the present. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.